I'm really delighted to be with you here today for what I think is a wonderful event. It really is a partnership between World Discoveries and the Morissette Institute. That said, Suzanne has been absolutely the lead on putting this together in the event today, and her team with Rebecca and Alicia. I want to thank them for all their efforts going into this. The Innovation Ambassadors really help us support an innovation mindset here at Western. These are self-identified researchers from all across campus who have expertise in commercialization or a strong interest in entrepreneurship and how they take their research into the market effectively. Through their work across campus, our ambassadors are really charged with helping us spread the gospel of innovation and entrepreneurship, help us connect with other like-minded folks across the university, and help us move the culture at Western towards one that is way more accepting of commercialization. So I'm really delighted to have all the wonderful panelists we have with us today. I want to thank each of them for their time. I want to thank each of the participants for joining us today. I think today looks to be a wonderful experience with the panelists and the different topics that we'll be covering. I know that I'm looking forward to Adrian speak. But before that, I'm going to turn it back to Suzanne, who's been just a wonderful partner at World Discoveries, and she'll do the official introduction. So Suzanne, back to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Adrian Owen, today. Dr. Owen is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience and Imaging in departments of Physiology and Pharmacology and Psychology at Western University. He also directs the Brain, Mind, and Consciousness program funded by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and is one on the executive committee of the CIFRAF funded initiative BrainScan at Western. Adrian Owen is best known for showing that functional neuroimaging can reveal conscious awareness in some patients who appear to be entirely vegetative, and can even allow some of these individuals to communicate their thoughts and wishes to the outside world. These findings have attracted widespread media attention on TV, radio, in print, and online, and have been the subject of many TV and radio documentaries. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Owen in 2010 when he was looking into commercialization of software-based assessments that he had developed through his work as a professor. Our work together at World Discovery supported Dr. Owen's journey into formation of a Cambridge Brain Sciences startup, which has grown to be a leading provider for the assessment of cognitive function. Please welcome Dr. Owen.
Thanks very much, Suzanne, and thanks for the introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to give this this keynote this morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what you just introduced, Cambridge Brain Sciences, and I'm going to put it in the context of something very typical, which is our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll just begin by sharing my screen. There we go. Somebody shout out if you can't see my slides. So I'm going to talk about the cognitive and neurological consequences of COVID-19 and how we've gone about addressing a number of questions that are still, I think, still emerging from this pandemic. Now, as more and more people are recovering from the effects of COVID-19, it's becoming apparent that many of them are suffering from both short and long-term neurological deficits. And these include things like headaches, aches and pains. I'm sure everybody listening to this has heard about loss of smell as being a cardinal symptom of COVID-19, but also in some cases more serious conditions like blurred vision, strokes, particularly in young people, seizures and delirium have all been reported during the recovery period of COVID-19. What I'm going to talk about today is mostly is impaired cognition, and by that I mean impairments in things like memory, decision making, the ability to attend or concentrate, problem solving, planning, these sorts of things. And I'll go into a bit more detail. It became apparent to me, I guess in about April or May of last year, that people started to report that they were having issues with what most people in the outside world referred to as brain fog. And brain fog, like things like chemo brain or pump head, these other expressions that some of you will have probably heard of. Brain fog means absolutely nothing to a neuroscientist. We really don't know what it means. That doesn't mean that we don't take it seriously. Obviously, these people have something. They are reporting symptoms. They don't feel right. But what exactly is wrong with them? And in May of last year, I decided to set about trying to investigate this question. Now, the big, I guess the sort of big questions for a neuroscientist would be, well, this is a respiratory disease. Why is it affecting the brain at all? And there's two basic answers to that question. One is it could be through direct effects. And by that, I mean the virus could be actually attacking brain cells themselves, getting across the blood-brain barrier into the brain and affecting the brain itself. And to be honest, the jury is still out on exactly whether this is the case or not, or how it is the case. But I've just selected one review here that came out in February that is certainly moving us in the direction of confirming that in some cases, at least, the COVID-19 virus can have a direct effect on the brain. So yes, it's a respiratory disease, but it affects all of the organs in the body, and the brain is possibly not immune to that. What I know a little bit more about, and what a lot of my work has been on indirect effects on the brain. And I guess my best example of this is prior to the pandemic. Most of my career has been spent looking at patients who have very severe brain disorders, as Suzanne kindly mentioned in her introduction. But many of these patients come into the hospital with something like, or after something like a cardiac arrest, a heart attack. And again, you might be thinking, well, that's the heart, that's got nothing to do with the brain. But of course, when you have a cardiac arrest, the main thing that happens is there's an interruption of the blood supply to your brain. And many patients who have cardiac arrests leave the hospital with their heart restored, but their brain never restored, because of course the sorts of brain damage that are caused by oxygen deprivation is often permanent. The coronavirus also appears to, in some participants, produce blood clots. And again, blood clots lead to an interruption of the oxygen supply to the brain. But where this is most evident, I think, is in people who are hospitalized. When you're hospitalized, when you go on a ventilator, when you're sedated, all of these things are well known to affect the brain. And here's an example from a paper we published in 2019 from here at Western, where we followed a group of patients who entered one of the ICUs in London without a brain injury. These were people that were turning up with cardiac arrest, or sepsis, or various conditions that liver failures and other one, various conditions that were not ostensibly about the brain. And actually, of the 20 patients we followed, all 20, when they left the ICU, had cognitive impairments, even though they'd not entered the ICU with any kind of brain injury per se. And that's an indication, and this is actually well known amongst ICU intensivists. Many of them will tell you, well, everybody knows that nobody ever leaves the ICU and feels the same again. And we don't know exactly why this is, but it is probably a combination of interrupted oxygen supply, being on a ventilator. To do that, to be ventilated, you have some pretty hardcore sedatives on board. Some of those sedatives are known to have long-term effects on cognition. Even sleep deprivation in the ICU is something that many people experience, and it can have profound effects on brain function. So there's good background evidence to believe, either directly or indirectly, that the COVID-19 could be affecting brain function. And here's the problem as I see it. There are now more than 160 million people in the world with COVID-19 and 1.3 million in Canada alone. And a year from now, if these people, even if only 10% of these people are experiencing cognitive problems, we are going to create an enormous economic and societal problem of people who have these issues that affect their jobs and their ability to go about their daily activities. And I've argued, and I'll continue to argue, that if we don't get on top of this, this could be a problem for society that is big as the problem caused by the pandemic itself. Now, I was in a very fortunate position when the pandemic hit. In some senses, I count myself lucky, because for the last, almost 30 years, I've been developing an online cognitive assessment platform through my through my lab. It's called Cambridge Brain Sciences. And it was designed to allow remote testing. Of course, I didn't have pandemics in mind when I designed it, and I'll tell you a bit about the background in a moment. But it was really designed for doing mass studies, studies of the general public, the sorts of studies that you couldn't possibly do in the lab for financial and logistical reasons. I'll tell you about some of those as well in a moment. But as you can see here, the tests are presented on any computer. They run on any internet platform, and they've been used by many groups now around the world to assess things like memory and concentration and problem solving and decision making. But let me give you a little bit of background, both on the science side and on the building the business side, as how we came to be in the position at the beginning of the pandemic to deploy this tool to address some of these important questions. So what many people outside of neuroscience, I think, don't appreciate is that our understanding of how the brain performs cognitive functions like memory and concentration really has only has only come about over the last 25 years or so. Even as late as the late 70s and the early 1980s, we knew very little about how things like memory were organized in terms of the brain. And in fact, up until that point, almost all cognitive tests were not based on the brain at all. Now, prior to moving to Western in 2010, I spent 16 years at the University of Cambridge, and I worked at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit. It used to be known as the Applied Psychology Unit, and anybody who's studied psychology will know that this is one of the sort of premier psychology institutions worldwide, in the sense that it's been around for decades and decades and has produced some of the world's most famous psychologists. And a lot of the work that went on in the Applied Psychology Unit, particularly after the Second World War in the 1950s and the 1960s, was to develop some of the things, some of the methods and the tools that we absolutely take for granted now. And this is taken from an article I wrote a little bit about the history of the MRC recently. The article was called Card Sorting on Mount Everest. And it refers to an expedition in the late 1950s, led by Sir Edmund Hillary, up Mount Everest. It was called the Silver Hut Expedition. And one of the things they did on that expedition was they sent all the climbers up with decks of cards. And at various points on Everest, the climbers were asked to sort the cards into suits or into numbers or whatever. The details aren't important. And it was an experiment to try and find out how both fatigue and altitude affected cognitive performance. And that was very indicative of the sorts of brain experiments or studies that went on around the world right up until, as I say, the early 1980s. And that is, people weren't really concerned about, or at least they didn't really understand anything about the underlying brain problems involved. What they were really interested in is performance. How does this affect your ability to sort cards? And indeed, the photos you're looking at the bottom there are some of the things that were developed, some of the methods that we used to develop, some of the things that we take for granted now. On the right-hand side, sorting ability. So the postcode system was developed in the Applied Psychology Unit, and it was done by asking volunteers in those days from the Navy to come in and perform tests that worked out how many different combinations of locations and numbers any one person could keep track of at any one time. And that's how the UK postcode system was developed. Similarly, in the middle there, you see divided attention. You can see a member of the Navy looking at 4 clocks. And this was used to develop the systems that are still used today by air traffic control. And it was research that helped design the systems that are used that are based on how many different things any one person can attend to at any one time. Of course, if you're watching multiple planes take off and land at any one time, then you need to be able to keep track of all sorts of things at once. The left-hand side, vigilance. It was also the drink drive laws were also developed through research at the Applied Psychology Unit. So that's just sort of some background to tell you that there were lots of different cognitive tests around back in the day, but they didn't really have the brain in mind. They had behavior in mind. Now, this is a slide just to prove that I haven't aged a bit in 30 years. That's me in about 1988. I was a graduate student working in Cambridge in the UK and at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. And what I did for my PhD was to try and take some of these tests that existed in the world and start turning them into computerized tests. Now, of course, this was actually, it was in the years before PCs arrived on every desk. We used BBC Micros back in those days. We did have touch sensitive screens, which I'm amazed that 30 years later, I can say we were using touch sensitive screens in the late 80s. They were nothing like as sophisticated as today's tablets. But what we did is we took existing tests and we put them on a computer, on a touch sensitive screen. And we tried to work out if we could adapt the tests to make them sensitive to problems with the brain. And what I did is I would drive all over south of England, visiting patients who'd had surgery to have particular parts of their brain removed. You can see a scan there of a patient who has damage to their frontal lobe. And what I would do is I would sort of turn up at their house in my battered old graduate student car, get out this enormous computer, because every computer was enormous in those days, take it into the house, test the person. And my sort of philosophy at the time was, well, let's see what this person can't do. And whatever it is they're bad at, whatever it is they can't do, must be what that missing bit of the brain was supposed to help them with. And I would go back to the lab and I would adapt the tests to make them a bit more sensitive. And I'd go back out and find other patients. And gradually we sort of work around the brain, finding patients with damage to all sorts of different areas, literally mapping cognitive tasks to brain regions. And this was some of the early work that allowed us to show how things like memory and concentration and problem solving are carried out by brain regions and networked brain regions. Now, in 1990, functional neuroimaging really exploded around the world. First, it was PET, positron emission tomography. Most recently, the technology is based on MRI, and functional MRI is the technique that we use. And this was a massive opportunity for me because it allowed us for the first time to put healthy people into scanners and see their brain actually doing tasks in real time. This was a tremendously exciting period for neuroscience. And every day we would just have queues of young, enthusiastic people that wanted to see their brain in the scanner. And we would put them into the scanner and I would have them do some of my tests. And again, now instead of having to wait for a patient to come along with a particular type of brain damage, all I had to do was to take a healthy person, put them in the scanner, have them do a task and work out which bits of the brain were being activated. And this was another method that we used to map these different brain regions. And let me just give you an example of one of the tests here so you know a little bit more of what I'm talking about. There's you can see somebody performing the test there on the left-hand side. This is our odd one out task. It's a test of reasoning ability. Don't get too excited. These are really easy problems you're looking at the moment. It gets much harder very soon. But the idea is there's 9 shapes on the screen and you just have to find the one that's the odd one out. You can probably tell already it's starting to get more difficult. And this is a characteristic of all of our tests, is that they quickly get more difficult if you're good at them, and they quickly get easier if you're bad at them. And that's a very fast way that we found to iterate towards somebody's actual cognitive ability. So the battery comprises 12 tests like that. And with the advent of the internet, I found that if we put these tests out on the web, made them available for everybody, for the general public, we can start to do some really cool new science. And that is science that involves huge numbers of people. So, I mean, typically up until that point, if I was going to test something like whether brain training works, for example, I would maybe get 20 people, bring them into the lab, have them do some brain training and then sort of send them home again. What this allowed us to do is by having this Cambridge Brain Sciences out on the web, it allowed us to do massive tests. So for example, in 2010, collaboration with the BBC, we did a project that appeared in the journal Nature, putting brain training to the test, where we had 11,000 people who brain trained using a commercial brain trainer for 6 weeks. We tested them on Cambridge Brain Sciences at the beginning and at the end to see whether there were any effects of brain training. Spoiler alert, unfortunately, there weren't. Commercial brain training doesn't seem to make you any smarter after all. In 2012, we broke our record and we tested 44,000 participants. And I mean, it's inconceivable to run a study with that many people in a lab-based way. You just couldn't do it. But here we had 44,000 people that logged in, did all of our tests, told us a lot of information about themselves, and allowed us to publish this influential paper in the journal Neuron about human intelligence and how the brain achieves what we generally think of as human intelligence. The important point is that data was collected in 2 weeks, 44,000 people in just 2 weeks. And that's the power of these sort of these massive web-based public experiments. Now, some of you know, in 2010, I moved from Cambridge to Western to take up the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience and Imaging at Western. And one of the components, so this was a $10 million federally funded chair. It had to have matching funds from Western. So it was very attractive for me to actually, I came here with 11 members of my team. And it was an attractive way of building a new lab from the ground up with really good funding. But one important component of the CERC award was commercialization. And I remember very well sitting in the Station Park Inn with Mel Goodale and Ravi Menon, dreaming up our plans for how we were going to commercialize some aspects of my science. And Cambridge Brain Sciences was the obvious candidate. It was by now a fairly well-developed platform. It was online. What it needed was some business sense, basically. It needed someone to take it, realize its business potential, and put it out there in the world. It was already being used by a lot of my collaborators around the world, but it literally involved people calling me up or emailing me and me sending them links or sending them, in the old days, floppy disks, and then installing the test locally. And it obviously needed much more than that to make it a viable commercial enterprise. At that point, I was introduced to World Discoveries, and Suzanne Armstrong was working there at the time and was exceedingly helpful in guiding me through the various processes involved in setting up a company and starting things off. I don't have a business neuron in my brain, so I had no idea what I was doing, but it was tremendously useful to get that guidance. And over the last 6 or 7 years now, the company has grown. It has 35 employees. It's growing every year. 9 of those employees are Western grads. It has a $2.5 million annualized payroll. Over 10 million tests have been completed globally now. And we have hundreds of academic and corporate customers worldwide. And the company sort of exists in a symbiotic way with my lab. I remain as the scientific director of Cambridge Brain Sciences, the company, but actually mostly it involves a relationship with my lab where we do the science using the tools that the company provides. And that science gets fed into the product. The company then adapts the product to make it to accommodate the discoveries that we've made or to include more data that we've generated. And that revised or improved product is then something that my lab and many other labs and corporate customers around the world use to their benefit. The sort of flagship of Cambridge Brain Science. Now, I should say that all of this, as I said, I don't have any business neurons in my head. All of this really is due to Mark Lipton, who was introduced to me. He's the CEO of Cambridge Brain Sciences. He was introduced to me about 8 years ago by a mutual friend. He had a business background. He was retiring early and wanted to move into something innovative in the healthcare sector. And Mark has really taken this ball and run with it, and has identified a number of really key healthcare verticals that the company has truly exploded. So this is the CBS Health application, which is basically something that's now used by hundreds of clinics around the world, and it allows practitioners, people like psychiatrists or neurologists, to do online cognitive assessments with their patients to get instant results coming back. You can see on the left-hand side the results score there. And of course, they can sit down with the patient and talk them through. The great thing about having 10 million people having done the test before is that we have a massive database. So, for example, if I were to take the memory tests, and I want to know whether my memory is good or bad, of course, it's not really good to compare me to the general population. What you really like to do is to compare me to all the other 55-year-old British males, because we have a particular demographic, and there might be reasons educationally and financially and culturally that make our memory performance peculiar, for example, compared to, say, North Americans or Asians. And this is what we can do with 10 million data sets, and this is all now fully automated. We can plug in things like the patient or the participant's age, their gender, their background, some demographic details, and we can pull out, I can literally compare my memory performance to 300 other 55-year-old British men, if that's what I want to do. So it's tremendously powerful. It's all fully automated, and I can say that it's absolutely elegant and beautiful. I can say that because I had absolutely nothing to do with the recent design innovations that Mark and his team have brought about. So that's where we were in April of last year, and suddenly we had this pandemic upon us, and here I am sitting here with this tool with a 25-year history that is tailor-made for online assessment. Now, obviously, the problem with an infectious disease like COVID-19 is that we can't go out and test people. We can't actually bring them into the lab. All of that stopped for the last year. But we have this tool already for online cognitive assessment. The tests have been optimized so that people can actually assess themselves. You don't even need to have a practitioner present. So it was almost a perfect storm, really. And I don't think it's any coincidence that since the pandemic has started, the uptake of use of the Cambridge Brain Sciences platform has been exponential, because, of course, this is a problem that everybody has around the world. How do you assess people's cognition, not just in the COVID-19 context, but how do you assess your patient with Alzheimer's disease when you've been, you can't go and they can't come to the clinic because of the COVID-19 restrictions? Well, you could do it online with a valid and reliable cognitive assessment tool. So it's been incredibly popular. But for me, it was also perfect because I wanted to look at how COVID-19 might be affecting brain function. So very quickly, I mean, this is a study that went from the initial idea to rolling out in about 6 weeks, which is absolutely unheard of in my lab. Really, all we had to do is to apply to the ethics committee for permission to do this, and then we were good to go. We put out ads. We ran a lot of ads on social media. We developed a website, COVID Brain Study, or a landing page, covidbrainstudy.com, where anybody that had COVID could log in, tell us about their experiences, and perform the tests. And here's some of the key questions that we've said about asking here. So the first one is, does the COVID-19 infection result in significant cognitive impairment at all? And that's, it's a really important question. Just because lots of people say they don't feel quite right, on social media after COVID-19 doesn't mean that it's a real thing. It doesn't mean that it is really affecting cognitive performance. So it's important to establish that. But if so, what aspects of cognition are affected? Is it people's memory? Is it their ability to concentrate? And again, that's really important to understand as we move forward in rehabilitating and guiding people back to their normal working lives. How is it related to the severity of the disease? Is it that it's only people in the ICU that gets affected, or could it also be, say, asymptomatic people? Does that also affect cognition? That'll tell us a lot about what's going on in the brain. What about ventilation and sedation? I told you about our ICU study, and we know that both of those things are not good for the brain. Do you have to be ventilated to have cognitive deficits? What about the long-term consequences? Are these problems that are temporary? Are they just going to clear up in, say, 3 months? Are they permanent in the sense that they don't get any worse, but they just sort of stay flat. If you've got a memory impairment after COVID-19, you're going to have it forever. Or worst case scenario, could they possibly be getting worse over time? Could it be, and this is not unheard of, I mean, think about something like Alzheimer's disease. Could it be that COVID-19 infection is initiating a sort of a neurodegenerative cascade, a set of processes in the brain that leads to deterioration in performance over time? We're looking at that by following these people for a whole year after their recovery from COVID-19. And of course, by getting people to tell us all about themselves, we can look at whether it's whether it affects males or females more, whether it's age related, whether there are sort of medical risk factors, and so on and so forth. So I'll just tell you the results here. This is currently under review at a major journal. And these are just some of the early results. I've sort of cherry picked just a few things that I think people will find interesting. There are just 500 people here. We have many thousands of people signed up to the study. But we made a sort of a tactical error. And I think it's because in our rush to get this started, because we all thought, well, this could all be over in a couple of months, we rushed into it. And it turns out that, back in May and June of last year, when we got most of our people signing up, many people weren't being tested. In fact, hardly anybody was being tested at all. So we can't be absolutely sure who had COVID and who didn't. So for now, I'm going to restrict what I tell you to those people who, for whatever reason, had a positive COVID test when they entered the study. So we absolutely, at least to the extent that one can be sure, we knew that they had contracted COVID-19. Here's a breakdown of those 500 participants. As you can see, most of them are in this middle group. Now, this is the World Health Organization designation for COVID-19 severity. A 0 means you've got it, but you have no symptoms and you don't end up in hospital. A 6 is as bad as it can get. You're in hospital, you're in the ICU, and you're ventilated. Most of our people were 2s, which meant that they had symptoms. They interrupted their daily routine, but they managed to stay out of hospital. So not surprisingly, this, of course, is the majority of the people worldwide. So it's good that we have this range. We can look at things like how COVID severity affects cognitive performance. Now, another important thing, I've already mentioned the fact that just because people say they have a problem doesn't mean that they necessarily objectively do. We did some subjective measures of things like memory ratings and lifestyle ratings. We got people to say, well, do you believe your memory is as good as it used to be before you got COVID-19? And these subjective memory ratings correlate really nicely with COVID severity. So the worse your COVID, the higher you are up on the World Health Organization scale, the more poorly you rate your memory as being relative to before COVID-19. That won't surprise anybody, but it again speaks to this issue of, people that have the worst COVID think they're having the worst time in recovering, they're having the worst long-term deficits, if you like. We also did standardized assessments of things like depression and anxiety. We found that 1/3 of our sample were either clinically depressed or clinically anxious. And again, both anxiety and depression correlated really highly with physical severity of the disease. How physically affected you were by COVID-19 determined how depressed or anxious you were during recovery. Now, here's the main results, and this is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain exactly what this thing you're looking at is. It's basically a sort of a correlation matrix. We obviously gathered a lot of information on people because they answered lots of questions. So we knew things about whether they had physical limitations, impairments of physical functioning, whether they're back to baseline cognitive functioning, fatigue, anxiety, and depression, whether they're in pain. And what we did is we put all of this information into a huge statistical model called factor analysis, where we looked for commonalities, things that linked these factors together. Now, with all these lines in the middle of these circles, they represent the strength of the correlations between different factors. So, for example, whether you had physical limitations is quite strongly related to whether you're experiencing fatigue. That's not at all surprising, but it's very weakly associated with, for example, whether you have anxiety or depression. well, you can see it, many other examples. Whether you have pain is strongly associated with whether your physical functioning has been affected, but pain does not go hand in hand with things like anxiety, depression, or emotional limitations. That's what the middle of this circle represents. Now, these two rings around the outside were two factors that came out of the factor analysis. And what this means is that there were two groupings that best explained all of the data. And the two factors I'm going to call physical symptoms, and that's the inner ring. And physical symptoms obviously includes COVID severity, but also things like ability, or whether your physical function is affected, whether you have physical limitations, whether you have fatigue, whether you have pain. The color on the outside rings is not important. It's the intensity of the color, and the more intense the color, the greater the association with that factor. So there's a sort of a cluster of symptoms that are broadly all based around physical problems that people are having after COVID-19. The other ring, the outer ring, I'm going to call mental health symptoms. And that includes things like depression and anxiety, and whether people think they are experiencing emotional limitations. Now, the important thing to understand about a factor analysis like this is that these factors are fully dissociable. And that doesn't mean that you get one or the other. You could have both, but it means you can certainly have one and not the other. You can have just physical consequences of COVID-19, or you could just have mental health consequences. You could have neither, you could have both, but they're different. And that's really important for us neuroscientifically, because it tells us that they probably arise through different neuroscientific mechanisms, either directly or indirectly affecting the brain. So there's not just one package of post-COVID-19 symptoms, there's actually two. Now, what about cognitive performance? I haven't included that at all here. And this is a sort of a simple way of illustrating what we saw from the Cambridge Brain Sciences data. Now, the main point is that not everything was affected equally. I've just put 5 of the things we measured here: short-term memory, reasoning, people's verbal abilities, their processing speed. That's how fast you can think when you're solving a problem, and an overall cognitive score. And sure, 4 or 5 of them were affected, but interestingly, short-term memory was completely unaffected. People had no problem at all remembering things, even when they were really in the fog of COVID-19 recovery. Nevertheless, ask them to solve even a simple reasoning problem like the one I showed you, the odd one out task, and they were really profoundly affected. They were very slow to think as well. But the important thing, so how do they relate to these two mental health and physical symptoms factors? And it turns out the cognitive problems, load on one and not the other factor. That is, whether you are having these cognitive difficulties is completely unrelated to, say, whether you are anxious or depressed or experiencing, emotional problems post-COVID. There's no relationship at all there, but they're all strongly correlated with physical symptoms. So again, we have these two outcomes of COVID-19 that are dissociable. One really affects mental health, and the other really affects physical symptoms, your physical abilities and your cognition. Now, to me, as a cognitive neuroscientist with a few decades of experience under my belt, this is surprising, because we typically tend to think of things like cognitive problems as all being sort of in the mental health domain. If you've got depression, anxiety, some of these clinically depressed people often also experience cognitive challenges. And these things tend to go together, but actually where COVID's concerned, they don't. It's all about how physically impaired you were as to whether you have these long-term deficits. I should add, that doesn't mean we only saw these problems in the really badly affected people. Even asymptomatic people had this same, were experiencing some of these cognitive problems. So I'm going to do a very simple analogy here. What is it like to be recovering from COVID-19? And the answer is, it's like not having had enough sleep. In 2017, we launched the world's largest sleep study where we had about 40,000 people. Again, this was a partnership with the BBC, run through the Cambridge Brain Sciences platform. And we got all these people to tell us how much they slept, whether they were sleep deprived, whether they had jobs that interrupted their sleep, like shift work and these sorts of things. We got them through the Cambridge Brain Sciences test, and we published a huge paper on how different aspects of sleep affect cognitive function. And one of the key findings from that was that sleep deprivation, even if you're only getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep every night, doesn't seem to affect your memory at all. Memory seems to be incredibly resilient to lack of sleep. But things like reasoning and problem solving are profoundly affected, even after one night with not enough sleep. Your ability to solve a simple reasoning problem or make even simple decisions are detectably impaired. So the sort of short answer to the question of what is brain fog, what's it like to be recovering from COVID-19 is it's like getting up in the morning after 4 hours of sleep. It affects the same. Some aspects of cognition, surprisingly, are not affected. Short-term memory, other aspects, reasoning, decision-making, these sorts of things can be profoundly affected. So, and of course, there are additional questions like how long does this last? We're still in the follow-up stage. So this is just at the 3 month. This is 3 months after infection. We don't know exactly how long these problems last. What I can tell you is, and unfortunately, looking at our data, the length of time between taking part in the study and your last positive COVID test isn't related to how impaired you are. And one possible reason for that is that these problems are not going away. They are either stable or they're getting worse, but we see no evidence so far that people are getting better over time, which speaks to the potential long-term societal and economic consequences of COVID-19. So I'll just wrap up now with some conclusions. So two factors characterize people's responses. One was mostly comprised of physical components, fatigue, pain, activities of daily living, and one was more related to mental health components such as depression and anxiety. They are fully dissociable, and here's an example of why. Nobody will be surprised to hear that physically, the older you are, the worse the outcome after COVID-19. It's age-related, and that's not at all surprising. What you might find more surprising is the absolute reverse is true for the mental health component, for anxiety and depression. The younger you are, the more likely you are to suffer from anxiety and depression post-COVID-19. Again, that's another indicator of what I mean when I say these things are dissociable, is that they are probably arising through impairments of different systems in the brain. Point 2 here is that our objective measures of cognition deployed through the Cambridge Brain Sciences platform relate to the physical rather than the mental health symptoms. So the worse your physical symptoms, the worse your cognition. And that's not true of mental health. However depressed, however anxious you are, that's not necessarily going to affect things like memory and concentration. So the take home from our paper is that there are two different types of COVID outcomes. And we're now looking into trying to understand what could be causing these different outcomes. But one of them primarily affects physical health and cognition, and the other primarily affects mental health, things like anxiety and depression. And like all of my work, this was, of course, not done alone. Rick Schwartz at Sunnybrook Hospital was a major collaborator, in fact, approached me with the original idea. As Suzanne mentioned, this was, I direct the CFAR Brain, Mind and Consciousness program, and this study was actually funded by CFAR, but also had contributions from my colleagues, Cambridge in the UK, Western, here at Western, and also in Ottawa. If you know anybody who's recovering from COVID-19, please encourage them to go to covidbrainstudy.com. The study is still running, and we promise to tell you, each participant, how your memory is, how your concentration is, whether you have been affected by COVID-19. If you're interested to read any more about this sort of history of cognitive testing and how some aspects of how I developed Cambridge Brain Sciences, then I do have a popular science book, Into the Grey Zone. It's available in 16 languages. It isn't a science book. It's not a book for scientists. It's a book for everybody. It's a sort of a coffee table. I like to think of it as sort of a scientific adventure story of sort of how aspects of my personal life, things that were going on in the world, the emergence of neuroscience as a discipline over the last 40 years or so. And of course, some of these really unique patients that I've had the privilege to meet and work with over the years. So there's a lot of sort of additional detail in the book if you're interested. Otherwise, I think I have a few minutes left to take questions, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I think to the audience, actually, our Q&A is open, so you can actually type in your questions if you look at the bottom for the Q&A box. And until actually we get some questions coming in, I just wanted to actually ask you a question, Adrian. It's been very fascinating, and I know, especially with your the sleep studies. Actually, I was wondering, do you know that I know that sleep deprivation, they say it causes your cognitive impairment, but can you recover from that sleep deprivation? Can you make it up, or is there a portion of it that actually is permanent?
That's a great question, Suzanne. And one thing we did with the sleep study is we got people to say, how much sleep did you have last night, the night before the tests? And then we typically ask them to do the tests again when you've had a different amount of sleep. So if you had sleep deprivation the first time, try and do them again after you've had a good night's sleep, or the reverse. And what we found is good news, is that yes, you can bounce back. Even a single good night's sleep can actually reverse many of the cognitive deficits that we saw. So yes, the answer is sleep deprivation is obviously bad for you. Actually, also having too much sleep is bad for you. But you can bounce back by just getting one or a few good nights sleep afterwards.
So let's hope with COVID would be the same thing then. So we could
I hope so too, yes.
So we've got some questions. I think, Adrian, you also have access to the question. Do you want me to read the questions, or do you want to have access?
I can read them. How does COVID impact the cognitive or learning ability in neonatals? I have absolutely no idea, but this is an important question. I mean, one thing that's relevant, obviously we didn't include anybody who was lower than the age that they could complete the test, which is typically sort of 6 or 7. But one of the, I'll use this as a reason to tell you about one of the things we're implementing at the moment, which is child-friendly versions of these tests. We're currently working on versions of the tests that are hopefully kids as young as 3 are going to be able to do. Obviously there are limits for people using touch-sensitive screens and so on, but we are really trying to develop a version of the test for young people, and maybe we'll be able to answer questions like that. The online testing is remarkable, amazing to think about. Like big boxes and testing kits around. How young do the norms go for the test? Oh, right. So the norms actually go down to about 8 at the moment. One of the big commercial contracts that in fact, I think our biggest commercial contract is with a US-based company called Brain Balance. And this is a company that follows kids with learning difficulties. And they have they took on the Cambridge Brain Sciences platform and have tested about 60,000 kids in the, I think, 3 to 16-year-old age group. And that has enabled us to develop norms for young people. Up until that point, we only had 18 years and above. And now we have norms for kids going down to as young as 3 or 4, and many, many tens of thousands of kids in that population. Yeah, I'm really surprised that younger populations experience higher cognitive impairments. Can this be due to an older person's life experience or resilience? What are some traits in younger populations that can be resistive to these effects? Okay, so this is there's a nuance here. So actually the younger populations don't experience higher cognitive impairments. It's the other way around. It's the older people that experience higher cognitive impairments because they're linked to the physical difficulties. Younger people experience more mental health challenges, and that may be what you meant by this question. Now, why is this? We actually don't know, but we're tackling it in 2 ways. I'm just going to throw out an idea there. One possibility is that in some senses, and I don't mean to be rude about anybody, but in some senses, younger people might have more to lose. These are people that are obviously trying to hold down jobs. They may have financial insecurities. They may be homeschooling. They may be tackling, multiple young kids as well as trying to hold down jobs. So it is possible that this strange effect in young people, this mental health effect, is just circumstantial. That you're right. The person who asked this question is right, that in older people's life experiences, maybe resilience, just general life, what would the word be? Security helps them guard against some of these sort of mental health symptoms. But the other thing that we're really looking at now, and I guess I'll end with this because I'm out of time, is that we need to try and work out what are the effects of COVID-19 versus the effects of the pandemic in general, because obviously we're seeing high levels of depression and anxiety in the general population right now, even among those of us who haven't had COVID-19. So again, I'm going to blow Cambridge Brain Science's trumpet. We have these 10 million people. What we've done is we've emailed about 400,000 of them, the 400,000 who most recently did Cambridge Brain Sciences prior to the pandemic. We've got in touch with ethical permission with all of them and said, you did Cambridge Brain Sciences, say 3 years ago. Would you mind logging in and doing it again? And by the way, tell us whether you've had COVID-19 at all. And this is great because this is going to tell us what the effects of the pandemic are, what the people who haven't had COVID-19. And we can only do this because the platform has been around for so long. We've acquired all of this data and we have all this information. So it is a wonderful tool for both generating new scientific questions and tackling big issues like what are the effects of pandemic on cognitive and mental health. I should probably not answer any more questions, Suzanne, because I'm out of time.
Thank you very much,
Adrian. Sorry, just before you leave, this is Eric Arts right next to you on the screen, or at least on my screen, probably not on your screen. I had a question. I just wanted to give you a comment and a question, and it kind of highlights the objectives for today. But it's interesting when I was listening to you talk. I mean, we have several animals recovering from COVID-19 in the impact facility right now. And we typically sacrifice them because we're done testing our drugs or vaccines or other approaches. But the animals that we have infected are also fluorescently and bioluminescently tagged. So we also are capable of doing imaging in our level 3 facility. So it's something of interest, especially if cognitive tests can be applied on the animals. So it's if you're interested, it's something we can talk about, and it's kind of nice
absolutely.
segue.
I mean, you probably know that the touchscreen, the animal touchscreen test that Tim Bussey and Lisa Saxida have developed come from exactly the same route. We were all at Cambridge together at the same time in the early 1990s. I went off and developed the human version of the task. Lisa and Tim went off and developed the animal versions of the task. And there are many directly analogous tasks there that, in fact, we've been looking for an excuse to find a way of testing humans and animals on exactly the same task. So this would be a fantastic idea.
Yeah, many of the animals recover just like humans, and it would be, yeah. Anyways, it just dawned on me that maybe we should be doing more with these animals going forward.
Great, thanks very much for that.
Okay. Thank you very much. So with that, we're going to start our next panel. And I'd like to actually introduce Dr. Eric Arts, Professor of Department of Microbiology and Immunology and Executive Director of Impact Facility at Western, who will be moderating the STEM panel discussions over the next 45 minutes. Again, the audience is welcome to ask questions through a Q&A feature of the webinar. And to keep on time, I will provide a 5-minute wrap-up signal to Dr. Arts via chat function. And with that, I think, Eric, I'll hand over the podium, and I think you can introduce the panelists.
Yeah, I thought maybe just before I did that, I'll just give a brief description of what Impact is engaged with since the start of the pandemic. So we're interacting with about, well over 24 different companies right now and testing various products for antiviral activity for high touch areas, also decontamination room spaces, working on therapeutics, and also working with vaccine development with Young Kang and a large team here. Just to give you an idea, probably we've done testing with many different multinational companies, and we seem to be a go-to site for these types of analyses now. So, so far, in just a short order of time, like with vaccine development, some of the products that we've tested and that have gone through the approval process are now found in over 50,000 different retail offices and in stores and public spaces across Canada, university campuses, et cetera. So a lot of these types of things you wouldn't even recognize. They're in the background, but protect you from potentially getting COVID. And the work continues to go on. It's something we didn't anticipate with impact, just like Dr. Owen probably didn't anticipate to be looking at brain fog with a new infectious disease. But it's something we were prepared to do if something like this arose. So it was very nice to be able to do that. And the other thing I found was very interesting in this approach is it's become very multidisciplinary. So I speak and our team speaks more with engineers, social scientists, and a whole host of other individuals to take part in these studies and make them most applicable for utility in the population, which is not something that many of us experienced. So I'll just leave it there. And I'm going to introduce some people and I have them introduce themselves mostly, but that have been engaged in this type of research. And we'll start off with Elizabeth Gillies. So Elizabeth, could you introduce yourself? Because you probably will do a better job than I would. I have your bio here, but I don't see her on the, oh, there you are, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I'm a faculty member here at Western. I'm jointly appointed between the Department of Chemistry and the Faculty of Science and the Department of Chemical and Biochemical Engineering in the Faculty of Engineering. And I'm also part of the School of Biomedical Engineering. So we do research on polymeric biomaterials, designing new mechanisms of polymer degradation, and often applying polymers to biomedical applications as well. And so we have quite a collaborative program working with lots of different research groups across Western and beyond, and also with companies as well. So I'll leave it there, I think.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Steve, Dr. Steve Barr, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Eric. So my name is Steve. I'm from the Department of Microbiology and Immunology. And my lab works on or studies emerging pathogens. So we look at viruses such as Ebola, HIV, and for the last year, we've been working with SARS-CoV-2. And so we study various aspects of the biology of these viruses. And most recently, we're involved in a lot of, sort of diagnostics and therapeutics regarding COVID-19. So we work together with other virologists in the department to put our different expertises together to really develop some therapeutics for the community.
Thanks. And finally, Dr. Jacob Reeves.
Yep. So thank you. I'm Jake Reeves. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in biomedical engineering here at Western, doing research in surgical device development. I'm also a graduate of the Medical Innovation Fellowship that World Discoveries hosts, and currently collaborating through a MyTax International Accelerate funding during this time, which has been very interesting, as kind of surgery has kind of gone up and down in terms of its availability.
Thanks. So, so I'm just going to go by your first names. I hope that's all right for Dr. Gillies, Dr. Reeves, and Dr. Barr. So we move from the formalities. So I'm just going to, something just popped into my head, and I'm going to start with Jacob, just because we're working, and I'd like your opinion on safe surgical approaches in the time of COVID. So we're working with lay Sowerby in the surgical department and testing different devices that are used for surgery, like cautery knives and laser dissection knives, and the fear that these plumes would result in transmission. And it turns out that the heat of those knives don't induce exposure for infection. But I'm just curious, from your perspective, how safe surgical techniques and different approaches used in the hospital now are with COVID patients. I wonder if you comment on that.
Sure. No, I think that's a very interesting thing that's kind of come out of all of this, is starting to take a secondary look at what PPE is currently being used that's practical and not. I know that in the work that I do, we're primarily working with cadaveric samples. So everything has gone through additional testing than what we would have had originally, which has been very interesting to have to deal with on top of everything else. But it's definitely a new concern, and I think it's something that's coming down the line more in terms of ethics as we start to apply to additional studies. Something to look at. So very interesting.
Sorry, Jacob, I think there's something wrong with your microphone feed. So just if you could. Oh, much better. Yes, thank you. But we heard you. It was just, it was like your voice, it was like a voiceover in an interview when you don't want to be identified. And I don't think that was the case for today. So before we get to Dr. Gillies, or Elizabeth, sorry, and I'm going to just ask Steve if he can comment on how his interactions have been with specifically like industry going forward with the COVID-19 pandemic and the accelerated pace of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, for engagement with industry has been quite remarkable. So in the past, I've never really engaged with industry very much just due to the nature of my research, but I was always hoping to be able to, engage with industry to help, develop products. And then when the pandemic came, everyone was, really looking for molecular virologists with expertise to test their antiviral products, whether it be therapeutics, drugs, UV devices to disinfect. They really need these level 3 containment labs to be able to test the actual virus. So a lot of testing in the past has been done using surrogate viruses or viruses that aren't as lethal. So flu, for example. So when the SARS-CoV-2 came along, it's a level 3 pathogen, and industry started scrambling, looking for labs that could help test their products. And with Impact opening up, it just opened up a huge opportunity for attracting these contracts from companies. And so I've been flooded, as others in our department have been flooded with, inquiries and requests for collaborations and contracts to test a variety of different antiviral therapeutics and devices. And so that has been quite refreshing because it's a little bit of a different approach than what I'm typically used to at the wet bench, just studying HIV or other aspects of different viruses. So it's been really refreshing. So we can actually get some hands-on with mechanical equipment, for example, and testing its antiviral nature. So a lot of these companies are quite grateful that, this Impact facility is available for that kind of testing, and the requests just keep coming in. So it's been quite good in the sense that it exposes us to industry, so that when we start developing other therapies in the lab with other viruses, we can keep that engagement with industry open. And they've been they've been excellent to work with. They're always looking out for us in terms of helping us, publish these findings or develop, other applications for their products. So it's been really, really good.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. And yeah, it's remarkable how accelerated everything is. It's, Yeah, I can only use analogies of illegal drugs to describe the research pace these days. Elizabeth, I find it interesting. I don't know how your experience is, and that's what I'd like to hear from you is, with impact and some of the work we're doing, suddenly engineers are our best friends. And in regards to and chemists and a number of different individuals that we wouldn't have normally interacted with because we're immunologists or virologists like Steve and I. But suddenly we have to look at transmission dynamics, fluid dynamics. We have to engage in so many different research aspects to fully understand what we're doing. So I was just wondering if you could comment on how your research has changed and the interactions that you've had and your experiences with COVID in development.
Right. So I guess I'm coming from a bit of a different perspective in that, I haven't traditionally done work really in the area of viruses. So, I mean, our lab, unlike you guys, where you were suddenly incredibly busy, right, when COVID hit and the impact facility, was really ramping up. I mean, we were actually completely shut down, so for 3 months, we couldn't do anything in the lab. And I mean, when you do chemistry, it's not something you can do from home, right? I mean, nobody has a chemistry, well, illegal drugs, as you said, people have chemistry labs in their home, but my graduate students do not have chemistry labs at home. So I would say, for us, the initial impacts were, bad, right, for our research program and, difficult for the students, right, to progress towards their degrees and things. On the other hand, I think as we learned more about, how COVID transmits and it's airborne, then actually we were really happy, once the lab's open to be in a chemistry lab, because there's not many places that have better airflow with everything designed to, bring everything away. So, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of my research area, there's two things that maybe have changed. I mean, I think people recognize, we talk about the fast pace of vaccine development, but I mean, the truth is that this is actually just the culmination of decades of research, in nanomedicine. And of course, chemistry has a huge role in that, in the, design of these cationic lipids that go into the mRNA vaccines. It wasn't magic and it wasn't first try. I mean, if you hear people present about their research, they, made hundreds of different chemical structures. So, so people may not always appreciate the, complexity and development that really did go into these. From where we're working also, I think a change has actually been a drive towards degradable materials as well. Part of that, I think, is all the plastic pollution, people just throwing away masks and gowns and, everything has become disposable. And at the same time, we had a huge group of people that, weren't, as I said, working in the virus area, who had maybe a bit more time to reflect and sort of pivot and change directions, and the government as well. And so I think we're actually seeing now a big push towards, more sustainable materials and degradable plastics. And so I've really seen the field change, both in academia and companies as well, have really used this time to take a hard look at what they're doing and how they're going to change that for the future. So I mean, in that sense, it's been, I think, a good thing, and it's accelerating that sort of pace of materials research.
No, I'm really glad you brought up that last point. It's very interesting because I'm sure you've encountered it, and I know Steve has, and maybe Jacob has too, but just the limitations that have been placed on us because of the vast need for plastics all over the place, but especially high-grade plastics for biomedical research and in particular for the vaccine production. And as a consequence, it's very difficult to get those supplies in, even for labs that are designated high importance. And then you start looking at the volume of waste that we generate in plastics, and it is incredible, and none of it is recycled. And it's interesting because it's deemed biohazardous, but almost all of us know that it's easy to decontaminate and potentially recycle. It's just not something we've done in the past. But you see the incredible need for plastics right now, reductions in oil refinement to generate those plastics fast enough, and it's remarkable what's emerged. So I'm glad you brought that up. So I'm just going to, so I guess, and you've sort of all alluded to this, and I kind of want to shift to sort of have an open discussion between the three of you, which on Zoom never works very well on a panelist discussion because, you know, having open discussions, but I'm going to say we're going to try it anyways. And so the question I have is, you know, what are new opportunities for your labs, your students that have been opened up now for COVID, and where have doors potentially closed aside from the obvious shutdowns that have impacted all of us? And I apologize when I'm doing this panelist thing, because I'm constantly looking at other screens, so it looks like my attention's drawn elsewhere, but it's not actually the case. So so Jacob, maybe you can start us off. So just kind of, and I'm just going to let you guys go free flow in discussion and just go back and forth. And maybe you can talk about just, you know, how has this impacted us on a research perspective, both good and bad, and how will it change things in the future is basically what I'm asking.
Sure. So in my research directly, I mentioned I was a MITAC's International Accelerate Fellow. So I'm collaborating with a surgical equipment company in Florida. So the week that COVID was declared a pandemic, I got a call from the vice president saying, can we pause this? Because elective surgeries got canceled and 80% of their revenue just disappeared. So there was an immediate kind of negative, obviously, associated with delaying the project 4 months. But following that, I think having done and been integrated with their team pre-COVID and post-COVID, even though pre-COVID through the MITACs program, you have to go down and spend time with them on site, I think post-COVID has been a much more integrated experience because I'm at the same level of separation from the team as everybody else at the company as well. So even though before I was working with, it was a group in Canada and a group in Florida, and now we're a group in Canada, Florida, New York, and North Carolina, we're much closer and able to actually collaborate on projects and get responses very quickly because everybody's kind of used to this digital framework we're working within. But so that's been absolutely excellent. And I think that through that, one of the opportunities I've realized is that as Canadian researchers, we can really leverage the cheapness of the Canadian dollar relative to the US dollar, because it's just as easy to work with us now as it is to work with somebody local. So I foresee this partnership extending far beyond the MITACs because the group has realized that there's a lot of value to be drawn here. And then in terms of kind of more generally within the lab setting, one of the struggles that I think has come up has been the limitation on how many people can be together in a room at one time. Our lab used to be very collaborative, and lunchtime was the time of knowledge translation across the table. So as a postdoc, I have a lot of experience with the equipment in the lab that isn't necessarily being translated properly to the newcomers. And I think that that's a gap that we're starting to learn how to bridge a little bit better, but was definitely an immediate drawback as former master's students were graduating out of the lab and PhD students have been graduating out of the lab during COVID. And now there's kind of this gap. I've noticed anecdotally that my dissertation has been downloaded a lot more during COVID, even though it has nothing to do with any of this stuff, simply because there's guides in the appendices as to like how to use some of the equipment. So I think that that's going to be an interesting opportunity for students moving forward to make sure that knowledge translation is being done appropriately.
Those are good points, Steve.
Yeah, I can
Go ahead.
pick up on that. I'm glad you brought up that point about the Canadian dollar, Jacob, because I really think that, you know, investigators around the world, especially the US, are looking for places to test their products. And the first thing they're thinking is money. And so when they think about Canada, dollar is, better, it's cheaper for them to invest and test their products here. And so when I'm sure this probably wasn't the initial plan for Impact, but basically when we built it, everyone came. And so it's bringing and attracting international work. And it's work that can be done in their own countries. But I think because of the availability of the level 3 lab and basically the cheaper dollar, it's more cost effective for them to get equally good, expertise for a cheaper dollar. And as a result, we benefit by, having an active lab and training our trainees with these highly qualified positions. So to get training in a CL3 lab is fairly rare. It's probably not as rare now because there are lots more labs that are coming online. But having that expertise is very good for our trainees because they can bring that to whatever job opportunities they have in the future, whether it be in Canada or elsewhere. So I think for the pandemic, it's really opened up that sort of opportunities for our trainees.
Yeah, it looks like we were we were clairvoyant in our approach, and we knew this was coming because literally we opened up the Impact facility about a month before the pandemic was announced. But it was just completely fortuitous. So we were caught off guard just like everyone else. But I do think with work from Steve and many others like Jimmy DiCiacos and Greg Decaban and Mansour Hayafar, and I could go on and on, Young Kang, we were ready to act, and that made a big difference for many places around the world in terms of testing products. So yeah, Elizabeth, what's your experience been like over this time, and in the good and the bad, if you will?
Well, I think in terms of opportunities, I mean, the pandemic really brought to light Canada's very weak position, in biotech and pharma and vaccine manufacturing. And so I think this is maybe more of a hope of an opportunity that, Canadians have realized that this is not going to work, that we just basically dig stuff up from the ground and, send it to wherever and hope to get back some vaccines and some, plastic syringes and stuff. So I think there will be an evolution, I hope, an evolution and growth in the biotech and pharma sector. I mean, Canada used to have a healthy pharmaceutical industry. When I was an undergraduate in the late 1990s, I thought I might become a medicinal chemist and come back to Canada and, work for Merck. And then I've seen that really that's just been eroded. And so I really hope it will be a growth opportunity and that's going to create a lot of positions for our students and, opportunities for us also to collaborate more with companies in Canada as they grow. And so, I think it's sort of, both a limitation that has been observed and hopefully an opportunity.
Good. So, I don't know what our time is like, but I just wanted to ask you maybe to each of you to highlight one specific sort of area that you see as potential growth in your own research, but in particular in interactions with industry and innovation and development that might, benefit Western, your own projects, et cetera, that might have been spurred out of COVID. And I'm going to start with Steve, and I'm going to make him talk about one particular project, which is our vaccine bank. Steve, so maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, when we've started this research on COVID-19, we really, I guess, took a more global look at where this could potentially go. And of course, pandemics, they come around every 10 years or so, more will come. And so really establishing this infrastructure now where we have engagement with industry and other academic labs is important because diseases won't go away. And when the next outbreak comes, the next pandemic comes, we need to be prepared and keep these collaborations tight with industry and other labs, because when a pandemic hits, as we all know, you have very little time to react. And by the time something is identified as being, a potential worldwide pandemic, it's already spread. And so the key is to act quickly. And so a lot of the research that our group is doing, and this is a group of about 7 different labs, is really trying to anticipate these next outbreaks or these next pandemics. And with SARS-CoV-2 in particular, these coronaviruses are out in the nature. They're in the animal population. They're waiting to jump again into the human species. And when that happens, we need to be prepared. And so what our team is doing is we are trying to predict and trying to be ready for that next outbreak. And what we're doing is we're developing a vaccine bank that has hundreds to maybe even thousands of potential vaccines that are stored in our freezer that we could pull out whenever we identify a potential pathogen that has pandemic potential, for example. So once that pathogen or virus is identified, we'd be able to sequence it and then take that information, go to our vaccine bank and identify the closest match that we think will provide protection. And because we already have that vaccine developed, it would be very quick for us to rapidly produce that and deliver it to these regions where the outbreaks are occurring. So we're really trying to stay ahead of the game this time instead of playing catch up as we've been doing over the last year.
Thanks. Yes, Steve, and I'll just add to what Steve said is, there's a lot of interest from pharma and businesses to this approach that we've developed as a team. And so it'll be exciting in the future, and hopefully we won't run into these problems again. So Elizabeth, how about for yourself? What do you see for the future in your own work, and how you might engage with industry and move certain things forward for COVID, but also for other things that you've kind of encountered over this time?
Right. So, I mean, as I mentioned, the degradable polymer area is one, but to touch on something a little bit different, another area that we've been working on for a number of years is antibacterial surfaces and sort of new polymeric designs to combat bacterial resistance and, infections in the body and, in the food industry and such. People have been harping on this notion of antibiotic resistance and that we're going to have, a huge problem really in not too long with bacterial pathogens. And so I think, what we've seen with COVID will, again, hopefully, wake people up to that big concern as well, because bacteria are actually very scary. I said to my dad early on in the pandemic, well, at least viruses, they multiply inside the human body, but, they're not going to multiply on your desk, right? They need our machinery. But bacteria, they can actually, multiply in the environment and form biofilms and really be everywhere. So I think it has reinforced the need, for researchers to also work on the bacteria concern. And so I think we'll definitely continue and grow our research efforts in that area as well.
Excellent. Jacob, take it away.
Yeah, sure. So I'll kind of take it a little bit differently, I guess, less from a research perspective, but I'm also the CEO of a startup company that came out of Western through the Medical Innovation Fellowship, commercializing dynamic balance assessment for clinics. So we were severely impacted. We had our initial market launch the week before COVID was declared a pandemic. And then all of our customers, after receiving our product, shut down, and it's been very difficult to get in touch with the local clinics again. But in taking that time to kind of step back, and with that kind of evening out of the challenge of getting into contact with anybody, we are taking a new strategy where we're trying to use professional social media to find the right evangelists for the product, regardless of where they are in geography. And that's led to some really promising leads and conversations with professionals. So we're now looking at rather than just kind of our initial approach had been to launch at London facilities and grow Ontario and outward that way, a less traditional approach, and now looking at partnering with a training facility for Premier League soccer, which is something that I probably would have done a lot more building up to pre-COVID, but now that it's post-COVID, everybody's just a LinkedIn message away. And it was always like that, but I think the burden for getting through there is lower because they perceive the connection to be closer, and everybody is kind of used to that digital connection now.
No, that's great. Yeah, I'm just going to chime in and just sort of say the one thing I've noticed is the increased need in general in our communities for enhanced surveillance, and how we've been stuck with just very classic surveillance approaches of, like, taking samples from people and seeing if they have this bug or they don't have this bug. And one of the things we've discovered is, you can take samples from all over the environment non-invasively and really get a good estimate of the burden of infections in the population, and in particular in wastewater. So, it's something where the accuracy of the size of the epidemic just by monitoring wastewater is incredible. So, I think those are kinds of things that it's been known, but it's only really been applied effectively with COVID-19. And I can see how this is going to be utilized in the future for many, many diseases, not only just pathogens, but also even genetic mutations in the population that might impair certain, functions, disorders, etc. So I think new revolutions are going to happen because of this pandemic. So I want to encourage anyone who's listening, if you would like to ask our panelists a question, just put it in our Q&A. We're going to wrap up relatively soon, but I just wanted to make sure that if anyone had any burning questions for our panelists, that you're able to ask them. So any lessons or takeaways that you guys want to leave us with in terms of, how maybe we can look at it in just the way we've now functioned in the pandemic to maintain research. There was a bit of time that we needed to come to grips with what we were dealing with, but in the end, we're talking about very important research and development from the three of you that has big societal impacts. And you just can't shut everyone down because we won't answer the important questions. So maybe you can just take a moment and just talk about how you've managed in your own labs and with your own workplaces to make sure that you are still functioning. So I'll start with Elizabeth.
Right. Well, I think, I think two main things maybe that I've learned out of it. One is to appreciate time and what you have while it's happening, because the future is totally unpredictable. And then the other is, I think, in some way to still stay true to, what you do and your long range ambitions. And this may go a bit contrary to some entrepreneurship guidelines, which would say pivot. But we were approached a few times early in the pandemic by people interested in, making masks, right? And, it was attractive in one sense to maybe jump on that bandwagon and work on that. But from the way that it was brought to us, I could see that it wasn't really a research question, and that it wasn't something that really fell within the scope of our long range ambitions. There are long-term projects that are research. That wasn't one of them. And then there's sort of the rapid, response that someone needs to massively scale up the production of N95 masks. And I don't think we were going to do that in our own lab either. So, so I sort of made the decision to, stick with our long range goals and work towards those. And I think now, well, even 6 months later, I'm happy that I still kept true to our values and long-term goals. So I guess that's what I learned.
And for you, Jacob, what how you've changed the lab and how you do work? You mentioned already with your company and how they had to alter plans, but do you want to talk more about that?
Sure. So I think it's kind of been a natural flow. I mean, in research, you're used to things not quite working out the way you expect them to quite frequently. So I don't know that there's been any really huge changes in how I approach the research from that perspective. But kind of speaking on this question that's come in here, one of the big pivots that I don't know we have a perfect answer for yet is in that knowledge dissemination within a lab and how you're going to manage that moving forward. I was fortunate that back in my master's training, I had a supervisor who was very keen on making sure that you had everything documented in appendices in a thesis so that the knowledge lived somewhere in the lab that someone could grab off a shelf. I know that right now, with more digital media available to us, I've been hosting webinars in order to try as a postdoctoral fellow in the lab to get that knowledge translation down to the people who are coming in now. And recording those is one opportunity, but some of the students in the lab have taken it even further and are developing like tutorial-based videos that they can host on like a lab website in order to keep that knowledge moving and retain it within the lab after the fact. So those are some strategies that I think we hadn't explored previously. We had kind of been sticking with what we knew in terms of you write a paper, you keep more detailed notes in your thesis, and maybe in the appendix you go into really good detail, but embracing that digital media moving forward is a key part of the research.
Excellent. And you actually did a very good job of answering a question that someone had in a Q&A for us too, so that you killed two birds with one stone. So good job with that. And then Steve, I guess in our case, it's been interesting because we never shut down. We were expected to continue just based on what we were doing in terms of the pandemic, but we still had all the restrictions that everybody else was facing. So do you want to talk about those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we're virologists studying a very specific virus. So some of us, are studying HIV, for example, for 10, 20 plus years, learning all of the intimate details of this one virus. And then all of a sudden, the pandemic hits with a coronavirus. That's a different virus, but it's causing this huge impact on the world right now. So it's like, well, all I know is HIV, but you have to take a step back. And so one of the lessons I guess I learned, and probably several others, is that, well, yes, I am an HIV guy, but I'm a virologist. And when it comes to it, a coronavirus is still a virus like HIV. It still has to do the same thing that all viruses do. They're killed, very similar ways. And so when it comes to applying your expertise, you got to remember that all your training was not just for one, thing that you're focusing on, but a general area. And so as a virologist, it's like, okay, yeah, no, we can take a look at this. We have the tools to look at it. We have the knowledge. We, know how to kill it. Let's work with industry, to help test their products, make sure they do kill it. So, for me, it hasn't been really a shutdown in any sense. If anything, it's been expanded and accelerated to expand our knowledge into different areas. So, I mean, for me, it was nice. It was, a good, wake up call that, yeah, we don't just know one thing, we know many different things. So for me, that's sort of the takeaway from this.
Well, that was good. Steve, you had the last word, and I want to thank the panelists today. I mean, I think you did a fantastic job in describing COVID interactions with industry, some of the innovation that's going on, and yeah, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, thank you all for your perspective and sharing your experiences. For me, I know that, at World Discovery, one of the things that we saw through this pandemic was the flurry of activities from different areas, and they were all focused on one aspect. So I think for me, innovation really is a team sport. And I think in the last year, that was one of the things that was very evident on our campus. It was that everyone was, rallying up together, trying to address a problem. And so from that, I just want to thank you all for all that you've been doing. I think we can now move to our next panel. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Claire Crooks, Director of Center for School of Mental Health, who will be moderating the Arts, Humanities, and Social Science panel discussions over the next 45 minutes. Again, the audience is welcome to ask questions through the Q&A feature of the webinar. And to keep time, I will provide the 5-minute wrap-up to Dr. Crooks via chat function. Claire?
Thanks, Suzanne. Thank you for that. So welcome to the non-STEM panel, as we are. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Education, and I direct the Center for School Mental Health. And my involvement with World Discoveries has been that one of our programs that we've developed over the past 20 years around violence prevention and mental health is now distributed through World Discoveries. And I'm joined today by my colleagues Claire Houston and Prachi Srivastava. And we're going to start by each of us talking a little bit about the work that we do and in our research and teaching. So Claire, would you like to start? Oh, you're muted.
Or I should have learned by now. Thank you so much for inviting me today. It's wonderful to be here and to speak with all of you. I am an assistant professor at the law school at Western, where I teach and research primarily in the area of family law. And some of the research that I do involves victims of intimate partner violence, children who are involved in high conflicts separations. And I'm also very interested in the participation of children in legal disputes that involve them. So that's some of the work that I do.
Hi, I'm Prachi Srivastava. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education, and I work mainly on the global rights to education in low and low middle income countries. And since the pandemic, I've been working on the global education emergency globally and here also in Ontario.
Thanks, Prachi. And as I said, we at the Center for School Mental Health develop, adapt, implement, and evaluate evidence-based programs for mental health promotion and violence prevention. And we have a number of areas we work in, dating violence prevention with youth and resilience programming for refugee children and youth. And we support an Indigenous mentoring program locally. And in all our areas, we look at how equity and mental health kind of intersect and what that means for our programming and our research. And I teach in the area of school psychology in our PhD program. And so it's been very interesting this year, of course, because all of that had to move online. And we're trying to, I was very curious about Dr. Owen's approach to neurocognitive testing online, because that's been obviously very difficult for us to both teach our graduate students and to undertake with children and youth. So I think when we were talking about this panel, all three of us sort of had this initial like, do we really belong on an innovation panel? Because doesn't innovation mean commercialization and that we're taking things to market and scaling them up? And we had a really good conversation about a broader sense of innovation and how it maybe means sort of opportunities for new ways to look at challenging problems, for ways we certainly, similar to what Dr. Owen was talking about, recognize that the pandemic has had direct and indirect effects. And furthermore, these are very inequitable in terms of the impacts on physical illness and loss of life, but also things like mental health, substance use, and exposure to violence. So, we're happy to share some of our experiences today, thinking about innovation in that broader sense. We're going to start by talking a little bit about our research and some of the impact of the pandemic and how we adjusted to that. So Prachi, would you like to go start here?
Sure, yeah. So I think one of the main points really in terms of the innovation was just to really think about how we could find out more about the impacts of the pandemic, at least in my for me, in terms of groups that are already disadvantaged and what the equity impacts are going to be. I mean, really early on, we had this discourse around the pandemic as the great equalizer. And I don't know if you remember that, but, and it is at some point still kind of used, but in a different way nowadays. But very, very early on, February, March of 2020, there was this discourse around the fact that the pandemic or COVID-19 is affecting everyone. And, you know, it's affecting all people, and we're all kind of undergoing the same issues. And very quickly after that, it became clear that that wasn't the case, that in fact, older populations were being affected much more. And then by around April or May, it became very clear, because we finally got the data, which confirmed some of our own assumptions, that it was affecting racialized groups disproportionately, people in low income households disproportionately, and a host of other related factors globally and here in Canada and in Ontario. And so that really brought to focus the severe impacts on equity. For me anyway, my work is usually looking at equity impacts and looking at what issues there are in terms of the access to education globally, but also what the issues are on individual households. And so when the pandemic became declared a pandemic, it was quite clear to me early on, I mean, even in March of 2020, that for education at least, this was not going to be a short-term disruption the way that it was being somewhat, I would say, misconstrued, at least in Canada. And in most of the world, there are a handful of countries that didn't look at it that way. And those countries, Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand, in particular, Taiwan, those countries really handled the pandemic, the early response, very, very differently. And in our context and in much of the world, the idea was that, the disruption to some of our services was going to be for a short term, and we would quickly get back to life as normal. And that included education. So most of you would remember last year that there were a series of short-term, quote unquote, disruptions that were planned, and they just kept getting extended and extended without actually having, in my mind, a very clear plan or very clear strategy. And it really was very blunt mechanisms in terms of open close strategies for our schools here in Ontario. That has changed this year in terms of having more localized open close, but still we didn't have a very strong response in terms of preparation or planning. And certainly for recovery, we don't have a very strong response in terms of changing the curriculum, for example, for 2 years, and really reframing the curriculum for all the years, and having remedial instruction and one-on-one instruction. There are a host of measures that need to be put in place. But the first thing was to understand data and really to understand what the impacts were. So that's where the innovation in my mind came, which was to think of how to visualize these data, how to make the data public. And when the ministry started to release these data in September, I contacted a host of people all across my networks to see if anyone would want to work with me to visualize them. And that's really how and to connect the case data with the demographics of each school. So it actually gives you more than just where which schools are affected or where they are. It tells you about that school population. It tells you, for example, if in that school 20 or 30 or 40% of the children come from low-income households, and what that means, because it does actually will impact that school and that community differently than a school which is in a more secure, less vulnerable context. So that was, I think, the immediate need that I saw vis-a-vis what I was seeing in terms of education disruption.
Thank you, Prachi. And you make some really good points when we think back to our mindset, which, the last 15 months is a bit of a blur. But as a parent, I remember initially thinking that we were getting a 2-week extension on spring break, and that actually seemed kind of exciting. And now when we think back, how totally naive and misguided that was. And your point too about this, yeah, the COVID not being the great equalizer. And I know that this metaphor has been attributed to lots of different people, but that idea that we're in the same storm, we're certainly not in the same boats, and that some people are in yachts, some people are in dinghies, and every step of our understanding the impact and our response needs to take that into account. So your initial innovation then was around starting to visualize the data and working with across disciplines or with other colleagues to do that. So Claire, can you tell us a little bit about your focus in research and how the pandemic changed it or accelerated it, or how you responded?
Sure. So as someone who researches in the area of family justice, the pandemic presented a really unique opportunity to sort of get an understanding of what it meant for the justice system, but also try to understand what the lasting effects of the pandemic might be, both in terms of the negative impacts, but also any potential positive impacts that might arise. So to give you a little bit of context, the family justice system in Ontario has been described by many people as sort of being in a state of crisis in terms of people being able to access the system. And some of the common complaints are that there's significant delay, that the proceedings are quite complex, and there's also high costs associated with initiating any claims. And the pandemic, obviously, as it did for many systems, effectively sort of shut down the family justice system for a period of time. And that meant that people who needed instant relief or just relief in general were essentially blocked from participating in that forum. And so part of the research project that I'm heading up is looking at, okay, so what were the impacts of the pandemic on people who were involved in the system at the time? So looking at not only the professionals who were working in the system, judges, lawyers, court staff, et cetera, but also the litigants who were attempting to access the system. I was particularly interested to know how the pandemic might affect more vulnerable groups. So people who were experiencing violence, children who were in the midst of high conflict separations, and also those who are representing themselves. So in Ontario, in some courts, the self-representation rate is upwards of 50%. And when the pandemic hit, part of the response was to shut down physical courthouses. And those physical courthouses are places where people find resources, including information about the law, but also just the ability to speak with someone like court staff about their cases. So we wanted to look at what the impacts were on those particular groups. But also the pandemic sort of ushered in this a new way of doing justice that we hadn't seen before. And I'm talking specifically about the use of technology. So courts immediately shifted to telephone and video hearings. Documents started to be filed online. These were changes that had been suggested as ways to improve access to justice, but hadn't really been implemented. And so the pandemic sort of ushered in these changes quickly, which is a positive. I mean, having the changes in place is obviously going to be a positive change in some ways, potentially in improving access to justice. But again, we didn't really have time to think about how to implement them in a way that would allow all people or more people to sort of take advantage of these features in a way that would potentially close some of the close the access to justice gap that we're seeing right now. So we're looking at some of these technologies. We're looking at the innovations that have been put in place to try to get a sense of how we might be able to tailor these moving forward so that we do promote access in a system that is historically not been very good at providing it.
It's interesting because there's been talk about trying to update and revolutionize family court in Ontario for over 20 years. And the message back is always, it's too complicated, there's too much inertia, it's too cumbersome. And yet you saw this very quick, this nimbleness that is not something that anybody would have associated with family court previously. Do you think that that will outlast the pandemic, that there will be more openness to new ways of doing things? And
so I'm not sure if it will. I think, I mean, there's a number of layers here. I think that it's difficult to get things accomplished in a bureaucracy that is family justice system or the justice system generally. But I do think that a lot of these changes are here to stay. I think that the the response from users and also from those who are implementing the new technologies has been fairly positive. And so I think that we are headed in a direction where we will be continuing to see hearings being conducted remotely. We will be continuing to have documents filed electronically. So now it's just a matter of ensuring that electronic hearings, for example, are used in appropriate cases, that anybody who wants access to electronic filing can get it. So these things that are improving efficiency have to be available for everyone, not just those who have lawyers, for example, and not just those who have adequate resources to be able to engage with them.
Yeah, and who read and write in English, right, or French. Are there any innovations around how to meet that? You talked about being able to talk to like a resource officer at the court to get help filling out forms, know what forms you should even fill out. Have there been any innovations around how to improve that access?
So I think one of the things that we're learning is that while technology obviously has some positive features, there's still a role for in-person services. Not everyone is going to be able to take advantage of these systems in the same way. And I think that court staff, legal information staff provide really, really important services for people. The other example obviously is duty counsel. So typically there are lawyers in the courthouse that individuals can speak to get advice about their case and to help them sort of move forward with their dispute. Those people have been available in theory by phone, but it's been difficult to access those services. And so while we may be able to improve that access, that remote access, I think there still must be a role for in-person services, and how to do that safely in the midst of potentially a future crisis like the one we're experiencing right now will be a bit of a challenge, but I think it's something that we need to pay attention to.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so in terms of how our research was affected at the Center for School Mental Health, we have a number of large intervention research projects underway, both in schools and with community partners right across Canada. And the short answer is that the pandemic stopped our research in its tracks, and in very non-negotiable ways. So we have an intervention research project with the local Catholic board. We had collected self-report data from 400 8-year-olds, and then in the fall, and then the pandemic shut down the interventions as well as the research. So some of those, there wasn't a lot of room to pivot in terms of the questions that were underway, and we had to start to think about some different questions that we could answer. Similarly, for our resilience intervention that was being offered in schools for newcomer youth, we had worked to get school district approval, school board approval from 8 boards around Ontario, which is no small feat. And of course, again, everything sort of ground to a halt. And so as we regrouped, we were still very much in contact with our partners, and we partner with children's aid societies, with Indigenous communities, with John Howard societies, with children's mental health, with different newcomer serving agencies. And so we were very aware of the impact that the pandemic was having on their ability to provide frontline service and the youth and families they serve. And so I think our biggest pivot was, I decided quite early as a leadership decision that our priority was going to be supporting our partners, and by definition supporting the youth that they serve, and everything else was going to be second to that. So our research was going to be off the table if it interfered with supporting our partners and youth. So what that looked, and then as a secondary part, we would look for, are there places where we can ask meaningful questions, and really meaningful to our partners, not just to the science at large, and do so in a way with low burden. So again, as educators, we're pivoting to try to do online learning and everything that entailed. They usually collect parental consent for us for research. That's not a reasonable expectation for them on top of that to be trying to track parental consent. Obviously. So I think where we saw some real innovation was partly in our service delivery. So all of our frontline partners the pandemic made the need for programming, for mental health programming and social emotional learning programming and violence prevention. It made it like more clear than ever that the people did not want to just sort of say, okay, we'll wait a year and see how things look. So there's a need for the programming, but our partners had some real concerns about moving it online and important concerns. So there's the tech and equity concerns of, do people even have computers and internet? But there's ethical and privacy ones. Do they have privacy? And again, these are not distributed proportionally. So we know that if you are a newcomer family, or a family who's come in through a refugee process, that you're going to have less room in your home, and you're going to have more people living there. And so can we do violence prevention programming and trauma-informed programming when you don't have privacy and there may be 4 or 5 other people right in the room with you? There's clinical consideration. So some of the programming we do, if we're talking about something like sexual exploitation or dating violence, and something that a lot of the youth may have lived experience with, they may need to step out of the discussion and to get themselves together and maybe have a chance to debrief with one of the adult facilitators. That works well when you're in person. So for example, at Children's Aid Society, when they're doing programming, if youth get upset, they're allowed to leave the room, but not the building. And then somebody will come out and chat with them. What does that look like in a Zoom environment? And more so, how do you even know for sure what's happening? If a youth is in a Zoom call doing one of these interventions and steps out, are they distressed? Have they maybe lost their privacy because somebody just walked in unexpectedly? Or is it just that Zoom is acting up, which we're all familiar with? So having to really think through these processes in a proactive way and make sure that we had good risk assessment protocols. But again, there was an urgency to the work that nobody was prepared to say, well, let's just wait and see how things settle in a year. And so right from the beginning, having important conversations about how to pivot online in a safe way. And one of the things I did, again, is from a resource point of view, then is reallocate our grad students and staff. So at the center, we have 15 full-time research staff and 16 grad students. And so, because they didn't have data to collect and enter, we had them out co-facilitating, coordinating, supporting our frontline partners. And so another place that we had a fair amount of innovation then was around developing online training. And so we're supporting online delivery, service delivery, but we do a lot of training with educators, clinicians, community organization professionals across Canada. And so, there's been this, and maybe what you were saying, Claire, there's been this gradual move towards more online training, but this really made us up our game, that we couldn't just do what we normally do, but do it through Zoom. Or so a lot more thoughtfulness around synchronous versus asynchronous and hybrid models. And again, I think that will be one of the innovations that stay, because it increases accessibility. Although having said that, there are many places around Canada where stable, high quality internet is not a given. So that's still a real problem. And I guess the last thing we did was really try to be flexible. And it's funny, listening to the previous panel, you realize that there's these common themes across different areas. So someone saying, I'm an HIV researcher, but I can pivot because there are enough similarities in how viruses behave. So we also had to do something similar around, okay, we can't necessarily study intervention outcomes right now. What can we study? We can study how frontline folks are modifying evidence-based interventions in an online or hybrid model. We can look at some of the impact on the frontline staff that we're working with, and that's sort of how we went with our research. So maybe Prachi, when you think about what your next steps will be. So you've started to really make some of these inequities visible in terms of mapping social determinants of health and income, and just sort of where COVID's happening. Can you talk a bit about your thoughts for next steps with that, and what other kinds of data you could try and link in and start to build even a more fulsome picture?
So the data set, so we actually used 2 data sets. We used, and they're both official Ministry of Education data sets. We used, the first one was on COVID cases that were school related COVID cases. And the ministry started putting these out early September. And they basically just, tell you which schools, which boards, and whether the case is staff, student, or unidentified case. And then we connected that with the school demographic data set, which is a general data set on all the schools in Ontario. And we really only looked at public schools because the COVID data are only being published by the Ministry for Public Schools. In theory, that's not a problem because 94% of children in Ontario attend public schools. And really by public, we mean Catholic and public. I don't know why we have that distinction here as both are publicly financed, but anyway, that's a different, I mean, my actual work is on privatization of education. I look at management issues. So it's actually a bugbear of mine that we keep having this distinction. But anyway, in terms of enrollment, we are capturing the vast majority of children, students, secondary and elementary. It's roughly 2 million elementary and secondary children that attend schools in Ontario. So, we are capturing the majority of them. But we wanted to really connect that with the school demographic data. And, you mentioned questions around like privacy. So this is school level data. So it doesn't tell you which child is infected. It doesn't tell you what the demographic is of that child. What it tells you is whether or not that school that has X number of cases, what is the demographic profile of that school? And the reason why that was important for me is because it actually gives you very important information as the school year goes on in terms of whether or not schools with certain demographics in certain neighborhoods are affected more or less than others. And so at the beginning, we tried to do some of this analysis early, kind of after the first 2 months of data were out. And we realized that we couldn't really make too much sense of it. Because at that time, it was very quickly evolving. There wasn't that much data. It was kind of difficult to see how that was going to play out. As time has gone on and as the school year has gone on, we now have a substantial data set that we can analyze, and we are actually doing that. It's something that I think is going to be really, really important. I can't think of another paper or study right now, at least in Ontario, that's trying to link that at the school level. So we are trying to sort of show whether or not there's a relationship between, for example, parental income, parental education, and first language, whether the first language is English or French, depending on and what the first language of the school is. And we're trying to see if those factors can predict or tell us anything about the rate of infection within schools. And that is and also where those schools are located. So it's a nested model. We want to figure out if the communities in which they're in also have, whether or not that has some kind of relationship and association. So I think intuitively, we would expect to see a relationship, but intuition is one thing, and actually, being quite rigorous about it and finding out whether or not there is a relationship is another. And so that's where we're working in terms of actually analyzing some of those data and modeling those data so that we can, say something about what's happened here in Ontario. In terms of going forward with the dashboard, so there are some technical features that we want to include. So one thing that we would like to include is to include like a time slider, so you could go back and forward in time to see how the situation evolved in Ontario, to see how it evolved over the school year. Of course, we're not entirely 100% sure whether or not schools are going to reopen. I mean, I think most people would say they aren't, but I mean, it's right now they're all virtual for an indeterminate period. And so we're kind of just waiting for that final like end of June to come, and then we could work on some of those. So that's more of a technical application, and there are a range of other technical things we want to do, like make it more mobile friendly, add a few other indicators. But in terms of going forward with it, so I would like to actually see how we could incorporate other data sets. And when I started this, you talked about pivoting, right? I always feel a bit about using that word because it seems like, I don't know, it seems like we're running after the next opportunity. And I don't think that's what any of us were really doing. I think a lot of us were just trying to figure out as researchers, how can we use our skills, or how can we help? the dashboard was really born out of this idea of how can we help? What can we actually do to provide information in a time when information is so fast moving and there isn't a central place to go? So how does the public, just the average citizen or the average parent or the average school teacher or the average whomever, really get to know or see what's happening? It's all very difficult. And the ministry were releasing these data in tabular form, which you could download as a CSV file. I mean, really, that's kind of fun for us, but I can't really, as an average citizen, that doesn't really give you too much information over time. So it wasn't so much about pivoting as it was about a real need. It was a real need to be able to show people. And for me, it was the first time I've really worked on education in Canada. I don't work on education in Canada. That's not my area. For the last 20 plus years, I've been working education emergency, low middle income countries, but the themes are basically the same. The systems planning issues are the same. And what the pandemic has shown is that the information that people have access to is fragmented. It's difficult to discern. It's hard to know as the average citizen or even as researchers sometimes, what is a credible source? That has a lot to do with questions around disinformation. Yep. And so the dashboard was just a very small initiative, started as quite a small initiative, me kind of looking at this data set and saying, hey, does anyone want to work with me? Anyone in my network, does anyone want to work with me? And it kind of then stemmed off as a volunteer project. It's all volunteer driven. The lead, technical lead and developer did this on his time, his own resources. And I have 2 junior developers now who are working on it, who are Western students, have now since graduated from Comp Sci, and they're working on it. We're all doing it volunteer because we believe that it is essential to have information that is credible and information that we can make visible in a way that is understandable to people in a crisis. So going forward, we'd like to sustain it. And we'd also like to see if we can add other data sets. Like, for example, wouldn't it be amazing if we were able to have learning data integrated on there, or mental health data like you're working on, Claire? That would be really amazing if there were mental health data that we can integrate, or other data sets from other geographies. I'm very agnostic when it comes to geography because of what I do in terms of the world is where I work. So honestly, if there are any other data sets that have school level data similar to what we have, I would like to put that on. And also to see if we could put on health metrics data for the different regions that we cover. So those are all things. I mean, for that we need funding. So if anyone's looking at watching this and wants to fund an innovative project, we can't sustain. There's also an ethics of sustainability in terms of being mindful about people's time and effort and all of that. So there's that. So for that we need funding. And I'm not shy anymore about asking for those things because it is really for the public good. So I'm hoping that we are able to mobilize some to keep it going.
Great, thanks, Prachi. I think, you made some really important points that it's one thing for everyone to know that there's these inequities around COVID, but until you actually do the data, you don't know the magnitude of it. Like, is it that these communities were twice as affected or 10 times affected or more? And so I think you're going to answer some important questions there. And certainly that's a challenge that when people, to use your mindset, when we weren't focused on pivoting as much as trying to help, and that you can get the cart in front of the horse from a funding perspective, that you didn't take the time to apply for a grant because you saw this immediate need. And so certainly people associated with World Discoveries and other groups around Western may have some innovative ideas around how to fund this important work. I think one of the challenges going forward is it's sometimes a bit surprising how little public surveillance data there are on child and youth well-being, and a lot of it is done either by school district versus individual schools, or by postal code. And postal code works okay in some parts of the province. In some parts, postal code covers a huge area in more rural areas, and also it doesn't account for example, Indigenous youth who are traveling by bus to go to school, that their lived reality and demographics may not be reflected in the postal code of their school. So I think there's some challenges there, but maybe an opportunity again to look at who else at Western and is aware of and doing some of these things. Can we use the health behavior for school age children data that are collected every few years in collaboration with the World Health Organization, for example? Yeah. So Claire, looking forward now and kinds of lessons learned and what you hope goes forward, or how it's changed the work you're doing, what are maybe just a few lessons that you would share?
So I think for me, the tension right now is being aware of the fact that the data that we were able to collect during this short time period was not as much as we would have wanted to, for a couple of reasons. I think the data that we rely on as legal researchers is often inadequate. So for example, looking at reported cases of family court decisions, we don't get enough information about the parties. For example, we don't have enough information about income. We don't have enough information about race. We don't have enough information about necessarily culture. So it's really hard to actually make great sort of conclusions or even move forward with recommendations without having all the information. So there's this tension, I think, between wanting to get more at the same, in the midst of this sort of fast moving, ever evolving public health situation, combined with sort of, personal limitations and having children and having to try to homeschool them while you're also trying to research. And then also sort of this other piece.
Actually, can I ask you Claire, can I ask you a follow-up on that?
Yeah, sure.
Any thoughts about how do you find, like, we only have data on the people who show up and engage. And so we have the same problem with our intervention research. Even if you have incomplete data, you have no data for the people who, in your case, went online, took a look and said, wow, these forms are too complicated. I'm going to stay in this unsafe situation for another 6 months because I can't figure this out on my own. So any thoughts? How do we get those voices into the research, into the policy decision-making context?
I mean, one of the things that we did is that we were looking not only at reported cases, but we also did surveys with professionals, and we're doing interviews with professionals and also some self-represented litigants. But I think one of the big problems is that we don't have data from the courts themselves. So we really don't have a really complete picture, right? Because the reported decisions that we look at are people who've actually initiated a case where there's been a decision that a publishing company has decided is important enough to put online, for example. So we don't see all of the disputes. So it's hard to actually notice the trends. And what I was going to say is that you've got this issue of not having enough data, but also the fact that COVID, it's important to see what happens moving forward. But I think a lot of people are kind of sick of talking about COVID. And so do you want to kind of keep asking questions around COVID, or do you try to move to sort of looking at what's happened as a result of COVID, and then trying to look at, how are those things working, for example. So, you keep moving forward with COVID at the same time wanting to kind of be done with it. So yeah, it's hard to know exactly how to move forward given all of those constraints.
Yeah. And actually, your comments about even like as researchers, people are all juggling different responsibilities and in some cases grief and roles. Certainly one thing that's come out for me is, we need to just recognizing the impact of COVID on frontline service professionals, and how we really need to build that into all of our initiatives and our research and what we're asking people to do from a research perspective. There's such a disproportionate burden of COVID, and Prachi's found a way to show this visually. So we really need to build those equity considerations into every step of our mental health programming and research in terms of what we're asking people to do. Can we at least reimburse people for their time? And again, I think as researchers, or historically university-based researchers have been a little bit oblivious about that and asking community partners and to sort of do all their work, or around data collection and engagement, and certainly I think that's been brought into clearer focus, is that we really need to find ways to be better partners with the people who are doing the really important frontline work with vulnerable children, youth, and families. And then certainly, you know, for our research too, I think just listening to what you were saying, Claire, the two sort of really parallel lessons for us. One, that this increased accessibility afforded by technology is here to stay, and you think about how we've all upped our game on Zoom in the past year. You know, that learning curve was steep for many of us, but there's still probably lots of room. And certainly being in a faculty of education, Prachi and I have colleagues who this is their specialty and what they do, online learning and engagement. And I think we're all sort of being dragged into that or trying to use that better. And the other piece I would say that you mentioned is that technology is not going to replace that face-to-face engagement. And certainly for us with our work with Indigenous partners and communities, it's been very challenging over the past year. How do you engage in ceremony through a Zoom call in any meaningful way? How do you show the respect and recognition of the importance of place when you're sitting in your office in London, working with people in Northern Alberta, for example? So some of these things, I think for us, COVID has shown that, yeah, there's an acceleration in some ways that we probably could have been more efficient and more accessible. And it also has reinforced that some of what we do in mental health and violence prevention does not translate well to online, and we're going to need that hybrid moving forward. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to open it for kind of closing thoughts. Prachi, I don't know if there's anything you want to, any closing thoughts about kind of how we're moving forward or advice for other researchers?
I don't know about advice, but I think certainly, you know, one of the guiding principles of our work, no matter what discipline we're in, but I think certainly for social science researchers, social science writ large, is really understanding the human dimension, the human toll of what we're seeing with COVID. And for, you know, the three of us, we all work in domains and areas where children and families and systems are kind of at the heart of what we do, whether it's in law or mental health or in education provision. I mean, that's, you know, that's what we're working with. Sadly, I think because we're in those fields, we also know that for whatever reason, a lot of times those areas get deprioritized or under prioritized, and, you know, they don't get as much support as we should think they should. I mean, at least in education, I've said this many times, so it's like now a cliche and probably annoying for people to hear it again, but, you know, it is the largest mass disruption to education in human history. It's affected 95 to 97% of all children and youth worldwide. How is it that this is not the number one thing, whatever little slice of work you're doing, how is it that this is not the number one thing we're working on? I just do not understand that. I can't understand that. And I'm trying to understand why the government responses to this have been wholly inadequate in most countries, not in all, but in most countries. Ontario within Canada has had the worst response. We've had the longest disruption to education across the entire country. We still don't really have a proper plan. We've cut our budget for next year. I say we, but, you know, I don't want to make that I don't want to make that like my response. We didn't do that. Our government has.
Prachi,
and
can I jump in for 1 sec? There's a question that I think you're probably best able to answer that came in through chat around thoughts about the future of virtual education and following this disruption. Are we going to see a difference in how that's playing out?
So I think the one of the issues, and this is being discussed right now because most people here would have heard about this hybrid model that's being proposed for next year. The idea that a teacher could be simultaneously teaching a cohort almost via Zoom, you know, so you've got children in the class and children outside of it at home on Zoom or whatever platform they use, and then, you know, you just go and do it. What that this is, I mean, there are studies that that virtual instruction is not always an appropriate strategy long-term for certain children, especially for younger children, especially for children that have certain learning needs. And if we are going to think about this as a sustainable solution, it needs to be done in a much more thoughtful way. I am highly reticent of this because I've seen some of the literature around it and all of the modeling, the global modeling around this that are showing huge learning losses and earning losses have taken into consideration remote virtual learning, and it still shows a massive learning and earning loss. So I don't think this is a really sustainable solution. It might be appropriate for some groups, but not as a whole school or whole system strategy. And education wants to look into, then that requires an actual plan. One thing, it's also around budgeting. So, you know, school boards in one of the virtual school propositions is that school boards are free to set up virtual schools, but they will not be provided any extra funding for that. So again, it's a rationalized measures strategy, you know, and all of this comes through a much larger lens of rationalizing funding and education funding. It's precisely at the time when every global organization, and I work actually with the T20, the G20, UNESCO, you know, the World Bank, like, you know, consulting with them and working on policy briefs. Every global organization has said you need to protect and boost resources for education. This is not the time for rationalization, particularly in high-income countries that can afford to do so.
Thank you, Prachi. We're at our time, so if people want to follow up on that discussion around virtual education, I would encourage you to connect with Prachi directly. There was one other question, Suzanne, that I put my thoughts in, but certainly the person can follow up with other panelists. So thank you both so much. You know, when we moved from 4 panelists to 3, I thought, I hope we can fill our time, and obviously that was no problem. So thank you both for your contributions.
Thank you,
Suzanne, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really actually very engaging discussion, and, you know, a lot of key elements that we have to think about, you know, that there's a lot of needs and problems that still need to be solved for time to come. Thank you very much, everyone. I think that now we can move to the next panel, which with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Simon Parker, Professor of Entrepreneurship at Ivey Business School, who will be moderating the entrepreneurial panel discussion for us this morning. Simon, do we have you on?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, Susan.
Yeah, welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be here and to host this panel. I'm a professor in entrepreneurship in the Ivey Business School, and I'm also heading up the research angle at the Morissette Institute. So it's great to welcome our 3 panelists today. Just before I get into asking them to introduce themselves and what they do and why they're here, just a quick overview of how we'll play it today. I do have a few questions I want to discuss and to have them give their insights on, including tech transfer, their success stories, and the inevitable COVID-19 and their reactions to that and how they've dealt with it. But I do want this to be more conversational, and having spoken to the panelists before this session, I think this is a widely held feeling that we'd like to try and get more free-flowing discussion going. And so to the audience out there, with your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, please forward all your Q&A as we go. And I'm going to keep an eye on it on a separate screen. And I will try and direct the discussion around it, so we try and incorporate as much of it as we can. Apologies in advance, we're not going to get to all of it, but I hope to pick up as much as possible. So I'd like to start, without any further ado, by asking Tyler just to briefly introduce who he is, what he does, and then I'll go to the next 2 panelists.
Beautiful. Can you hear me, Simon?
Perfect.
Good. All right. Thank you so much for having me here. I guess I'll touch the reasons why I'm invited to this panel. I'm a Western alumni and very proud of that. And there was also an experience with Propel and the Western Accelerator. So came out of university from an MIT Media Information and Technoculture degree, really looking at critically, how do we deal with information? How do we deal with media? And famous Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, and trying to understand, how do we process all this information and what can we do with that? And immediately after university, I don't know what it was, I just felt like I didn't want to take a normal job. I wanted to figure out if I could try to do some stuff myself and try to learn some practical skills with all that knowledge that Western had instilled in me. Very proud to have made that happen with the support of Western. Propel really unlocked the entrepreneur potential in my life and gave me that boost of confidence that was like, you can do this, and we're gonna give you this opportunity. Just a little bit quickly, former hockey player, so that was a big part of my life. At one point, I thought I was going to be a hip hop artist. That did not work out, but I still love language, and I've turned that love of language into this company that I'm working on now, which is Speak AI. Really, we're focused on processing audio, video, and text information and extracting meaningful information out of language, and very excited to talk about that today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tyler. Johnson.
Hi, my name is Johnson, and I'm in the scent business. I attended Propel, and some of the things that I work on is formulating scents for candles, car fresheners, detergent, and I look forward to sharing my experience so far.
Thanks very much, Johnson. And finally, Zamir.
Thank you, Simon. My name is Zamir Khan. I'm also a Western grad. I actually studied biomedical engineering at Western at the Robarts Research Institute, and also went through Propel with my current company, VidHug. And so actually most of my career was spent as a software engineer working in the medical device domain. So I have, if we're getting into a discussion about tech transfer, I have, some interesting perspectives, both from the research side and the commercialization side in that domain. But what brings me here is my current venture, VidHug, which makes it easy for people to create surprise group videos for special occasions when they can't be together. And as you can imagine, over the last year or so, we've seen tremendous, growth and demand for that service and growth of the company. So I'm happy to be here.
I can well believe that. And in fact, your interest in tech transfer, Zamir, probably makes it appropriate to start with you, so you can kick off the discussion. What I'm interested in, and I think a lot of people in the audience might be interested in, is sort of what's worked and what hasn't worked so well. So we can have a pretty frank discussion of what you think goes into a successful tech transfer type program and areas where we can perhaps improve practice at the moment. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I think I'd like to preface that by saying that I'm bringing kind of two different perspectives. One in my role as previously a researcher and somebody who worked on commercializing technology coming out of research in the medical domain. And then VidHug is a bit different. The technology in VidHug does not come from the research domain as much, but from the open source software domain. So that's also, an area to consider. So if I put on my researcher hat and, commercializing those technologies, we could have an 8-hour discussion about that. But, the quick things that I would touch upon are, I think it's always important to recognize that researching new technologies, and in my domain, software, and commercializing software, you have to recognize that they're two different pursuits. And there's going to be, it can't be a seamless process. When you're researching, you're trying to discover new ideas, new insights, and you're trying to iterate as quickly as possible. And so your goals are to, produce interesting and meaningful results, and to do that in an efficient manner, and in a correct manner. When it comes to commercialization, your goal is to build something that is needed in the market and will solve a problem and will do it reliably. And reliably becomes really important when you start to talk about things like medical devices. And so, when I switched from research domain to a commercialization domain, one of the big focuses became, on the technical side, taking an idea that was a really good idea from the research domain, but then implementing that in a, for example, a manner that would be accepted by the FDA. It takes a lot of work and often re-engineering. And so there's always challenges there, and things that can make that take more time and take less time. If I switch over to the VidHug side, today, when you're building things in software, you're going to be relying on open source software all the time. And so especially when you're building a commercial entity, it's really important to know what software you're pulling into your service or product, and especially to know, its quality, first of all, but also any kind of licensing or IP issues around that software. The software is just so readily available to pull in that often people don't think about that until it's too late. And I'm fortunate because the background that I had, that was always top of mind. Can we actually use this software in our software? And I took that approach with VidHug as well. And I'm glad that I did, because that can come back to really be a thorn in your side if you don't look out for those types of issues early on.
Absolutely. Yeah, wise insights there. Thank you. Anything to add, Johnson, perhaps?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, I'll come back to you later. Tyler, anything about the tech transfer space to either build on or challenge what Zamir said?
Yeah, I'll add my disclaimer is when we talked about this, just to get ready for this panel, I had to do some digging on the definition of tech transfer and make sure that I am articulating this. I come from, a university background, but never was too much of a focus with any of the programs that I was in. But the part that really stuck out to me through the process of Speak AI was the investigation that came about. So there was a lot of research in the initial stages of our systems, and just a couple, main components of what we have today, something like sentiment analysis. So understanding positivity and negativity within audio, video, and text data. And there was a lot of challenges to figure out, for example, what systems are readily available now, as Zamir talked about, like what can we pull in and use today? How accurate are those systems? What data sets are those systems trained on? And if we're deploying these into different use cases, for example, healthcare, are these even viable technologies to apply? So as we've started to be approached by different organizations, just as an example, one in healthcare, a lot of questions about the validity and can you use something like sentiment to help make diagnosis, or is it just a navigation tool to help surface moments that are negative or positive so that you can make a diagnosis quicker? So I think that's a big part that's stuck out to us. And there's a lot of companies right now that are just pulling together different GitHub libraries or tapping into APIs, piecing a bunch of things together and then presenting a solution. The part that I'm really, interested in is the different strategies that we're seeing in business, which is, there are difficulties in patenting software. But there's also, for myself, the main goal right now is let's make something valuable enough that people want to continually pay for and use. And we can figure out the pieces as we go, as long as we're still and have the ability to use and apply the technologies in a valuable way. So I think that's, my last part is just there's a lot of companies right now that are leveraging AI, machine learning, and there's a lot of challenges in that process. And what we've seen is great. You can understand something within your data or a new insights appeared, but what can you do with that information after? And that's a bigger challenge. It's great. All these analysis systems are available, but now what? And that's the big challenge that we're seeing, or the bridge that's trying to be conquered, which is how can we use this in a practical way?
So given the challenges that you've both described, how can institutions like, for example, the institutions that are being built around Western entrepreneurship, the tech transfer offices here, World Discoveries, Propel, how can they help? What is a facilitating role that as entrepreneurs would be most useful for you?
I'll start. I think, again, focusing on a software perspective, because that's my domain. And actually, before VidHug became my full-time endeavor, this is something that I was digging into with people at the university. I feel that it's important to, even though, the research and the commercialization domains, you need to recognize they have separate goals, and you can't merge them. But I think it's important to, especially if there is a research team or a research group that has an interest in commercialization, to get in there early and start thinking about the things with a mind to commercialization sooner rather than later. Because the longer you delay thinking about commercialization, it will make the end pathway longer for you to get to commercialization. So again, if I focus on software, if you're thinking in a pure research setting, there's just certain, I would say, software practices that don't make sense to spend time on, because they make you go slower. They increase the overhead on your team members, on your researchers who are on a tight schedule. I've been in that position. But at the same time, those same practices will set you up better to commercialize your invention later on. And so there's a trade-off that a lot of researchers are making, and only some of them know that they're making that trade-off. And so to get in there early and to discuss those trade-offs and to give options, I think is important. I've always thought, again, from a software perspective, if there's research departments that have a lot of software creation, I've always thought it would be a neat idea to have a type of like a roaming CTO role in that department. That wouldn't necessarily be someone with a research focus, but somebody who is available to these groups to go around and help them with software architecture, software design, again, with a mind to commercialization if that's of interest to them. That's something where you can invest a little bit early on, and it will pay off a lot down the road if you're looking to commercialize your inventions.
Yeah, as I said, I've seen, Zamir put out a nice divide here, and there's some systems that say maybe coming through Propel and Western Accelerator where the bulk of work is not going into research. It's about how quickly can they find a customer base, iterate, and commercialize. But then I look back to my own experience at the Western Accelerator, and I think of Frontline Medical Technologies, which was building a medical device, and the years of research that went into that product. Then to get that through FDA approval as a medical device was immense. Like I don't even know the full timeline, but at least 7 years. And the amount of capital that went to getting to that was enormous. And without support there was Western faculty supporting that. There was programs like Burst through Tech Alliance that's obviously closely connected with this, that made that first investment actually happen, and most likely even gave the founders of those companies, amazing people, the confidence that they could even take on this endeavor without, putting at risk their own life and sustainability there. So I think there are very different paths, and Western has different types of businesses to support depending on those goals, as Zamir nicely outlined.
Yeah, great points. Let me just remind the audience, by the way, if you've got any more questions that you want to pose to the panel on this question of tech transfer, please go ahead, and I will try and incorporate them, as I said. Perhaps while we wait for those to come in, we could perhaps move on a little bit to my second main question, which is really about success drivers. I suspect a lot of the people listening in are keen to know kind of what works and what doesn't. Like, what have you learned along the way that you can help other people who are perhaps thinking of setting up a new venture think about, maybe be aware of in advance before, as Zamir says, it could be too late, that you go down a path that kind of locks you in a less productive way. Any thoughts on that, guys? Maybe Johnson, if we can start with you.
Sure. So I'm in the business mainly candles, and since the pandemic, I feel that scented candles kind of have played an essential role in affecting mood, stress, working capability, and overall mental health. Candles are some of the most ordinary household items, and in many regards, completely and utterly forgettable. But in the pandemic, with so many of us being regulated in our homes, it's kind of become a category of home goods worth splurging on. one report that I have found that makeup sales did fall in 2020, but fragrances and candles and perfumes and have been gaining more popularity and customers searching for new scents. With our worlds kind of collapsing into one, the living room becomes where you go to work and pop up into happy hour or taking an online class or even just crying during a therapy. Lighting a candle can help shift your mood and transform a space, even if it's just for temporarily. So yeah, it's gotten a little bit more popular during the pandemic, and have really focused on online sales.
Okay, and so would you say that with this beneficial change in demand that you've observed, have you kind of stayed on top of all the nuances in that composition of demand in your sector?
With the stores being closed, the in-person kind of shopping experience has disappeared for now. But people are still shopping online more than ever. And I'm seeing that there are more people beginning to kind of create candles as a hobby and potentially taking it as a business and creating an online store. So there's more businesses coming out slowly, more entrepreneurship that are coming out from people losing their jobs as well, and focusing on more of their hobbies and hopefully turning that into something that they can do full time.
Yeah.
So what I've noticed.
Thank you. Turning to Zamir and Tyler, any thoughts about the stuff you've learned along the way that you could share?
Zamir? Okay. All right. I unmuted myself, so I guess I'll go. There's too many things to talk about here. A couple things that stick out to me. Some of them are what I've learned that have been, a proponent of success, and then other things that are the opposite of that, are like things to avoid, and that have been great lessons throughout this. And, generally one of the things that I've learned a lot from Zamir as well too throughout this process, because we didn't say that, but before this year even started, this pandemic, Zamir and I were working at Innovation Works together in a basement every single day and having a lot of discussions, both in this sort of foundational stage of what we were working on, and in a way some similarities, but also some differences between like the work that we were doing and how we were sort of envisioning business and everything there. And one of the things that sticks out to me, which has been both helpful, but then also difficult, has been like, we're helping people process audio, video, and text data. And there's a lot of people who are doing that. And that presents a lot of opportunity, because we get a ton of people who come and look at our system and say, wow, I would love to use it for X, Y, Z. But I would say that person's a lawyer. And then this person is a medical company, and this person's a marketer. And so although there are, it's great to get feedback and queries and hear that there's value for everyone, when you have a lack of, for example, an industry focus, it starts to dilute your efforts. You can only make so many people happy. And so while this initial strategy really worked for us, and in the start, we would get all these people flow into our system and make requests, you started to have to filter out customers that were not ideal customers. And one of the changes that we've even made recently was moving from this sort of freemium version model and actually pushing to a free 14-day trial. Allows you to test the system, but then sort of weans out the people who are not going to be paying customers, because really we shouldn't be optimizing around people who are just going to be free users, especially when you're a company, depending on the model that you're going. So just one other thing that I've stuck out to me has been like, when I started this, I was running a marketing agency, and I had a lot of clients that was working and doing marketing work, and it allowed us to sort of bootstrap the business and generate cash flow so we could continue to exist. And that's a wonderful opportunity and a privilege to have. But as you start to see opportunities, you don't get to double down on some of the software-led growth that you're looking for. Or because you're bootstrapping, for example, you might not be able to just go and like target market share and lower, for us, for example, transcription per minute cost. You can't just drop that to the bottom, because you could sink your company if you get too many signups. and just burn through all the cash that you have. So depending on if you're bootstrapping, if you're have some angel investment, or if you're VC funded, it also changes the strategy of how you get into the market and get market share. So I'll stop for a second there, but those are just a couple really interesting lessons that I've learned. And I would say before the pandemic, lastly, is like, I was trying to explain what we were doing with Speak AI, and I would get a lot of glossy looks. But as we all got accustomed to Zoom meetings and everything being recorded, our system started to make a lot more sense, which is there's too much media being created every single day. How do we find the moments that matter? What is the information that matters? And when we look at human language, communication, and conversation, there are crucial parts that we can learn a lot from. So how can we extract those, present those, and use those actionably?
Yeah, it speaks to me a little bit because I collaborated with another colleague at Ivy with the Cultureplex, who do a lot of this sentiment analysis. And we published a paper just last year on how the media portrays entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship relative to corporations. And so we did a lot of text mining from the New York Times and the Financial Times on that. And we found a very strong positive media bias towards entrepreneurs and new ventures, and a pretty negative one towards executive and corporations. And, the question is, how is that affecting people's willingness to get into entrepreneurship? Positive, presumably, but we don't know directly how. Johnson mentioned, that there are lots of drivers of people entering now, especially with this pandemic. But the role of the media is an interesting one, for sure. Let me turn to Zamir for any sort of success drivers you want to share.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about, factors that relate to success, actually the first term that I want to talk about is called survivorship bias. Because particularly, in VidHug's situation, this is a product and service that I started working on in late 2016. And it really took off, just over a year ago when the pandemic started. And so we've seen incredible success since then. But before that, I was, a founder working on a passion project, on a side project, for a long time in a basement next to Tyler. And, I would look to other successful entrepreneurs and say, see, what was your key success? And so now I find myself in that seat, and I'm very cognizant of, I didn't design this product or service with the pandemic in mind. And one of the sayings that I recently heard that really resonated with me is that because what happened to VidHug and a lot of businesses when the market shifts can be considered luck, and it is luck in a way. But one phrase I've heard is luck is when preparedness meets opportunity. And opportunity you can't control when it's going to come to you, but what you can control is how prepared you are to meet that opportunity. And so, when it comes to having a product and a service that people found value in, and having a software system that could scale to see the amount of growth that we saw in a short period of time, those we did have those. And one of the factors that went into that applies to VidHug and applies to, commercialization of medical devices and everything this is not my advice. You hear it all the time, but it's so important. Talk to your customers. One thing, I found when I started working on VidHug, I'm a software guy. I'm more of an introvert, and I built something for consumers. And I found at first that I would actually try to avoid interactions with my customers because I was afraid of what they might tell me. And the interesting thing is the most uncomfortable conversations you have with your customers, the most critical ones are the ones that push your product or service forward the most. So you need to embrace those conversations, embrace that discomfort, and put yourself out there to hear that. Because the people who are telling you, it's great, I love it, you're doing a great job, it's nice and they mean it, but they're also not telling you the entire truth. And the entire truth is what your product or service will never be perfect. And to continue to strive to make it better, you need to hear from the people who are willing to be critical to your face. And if I take myself back to, working in a space where we're commercializing, medical research into medical devices, I would say that is a space where that's critical as well. people would come up with fantastic new algorithms and ideas that could really improve imaging diagnoses and improve performance during image-guided surgery. And they would often be working with a clinical partner, you know, like a radiologist or a surgeon, but often they'd be working with, and this is just the practical reality, they might have one partner surgeon or one partner radiologist who really becomes the opinionated leader, which can be great for, you know, resources and timing. But if you don't talk to more users, you'll often end up developing something that one partner really likes, but isn't applicable to a broader audience. And so I would say, you know, there's many pieces of advice, but one is talk to your customers and talk to as many as you can and embrace the criticism.
Yeah, that's brilliant advice, Zamir. It's something we tell our students all the time, and also to not be content with a no. Like if you propose something like, would you use this? And they say no. Often what they won't tell you, and you have to push for, is no, but I might use something that did something similar to this, or that was configured slightly different, or that was targeted something slightly different. And so they're really your best resource in many ways, because ultimately these are the people you want to reach with your venture. So terrific advice. I have a question actually, which I just want to interject at this point. It's actually targeted at Tyler and Zamir. And the question is as follows. Can you talk about transitioning from campus to local resources, like, for example, Innovation Works, LEDC, and support from local founders and the London ecosystem? Tyler, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I mean, I came out of Propel, I'm trying to think of time now, time is hard, 2015, 2016. And this was just when Innovation Works was forming. And I remember coming out of Propel thinking, you know, great, we're seeing some growth here. A lot of things not working, some things working. And we don't feel ready to be alone in an office. You know, that was one thing that really stuck out to me, is like so much success, even through Propel, had come from, you know, as Innovation Works likes to call it, just like collisions in that space, conversations that were fostered by having a dynamic group of people all focused on building business and growth. And when I looked to London to try to figure out like, what is that next chapter, I was very happy that Western and Propel referred me to Innovation Works. And, you know, when I first went there, and I'm sure many people in the community have at least, you know, gone once or twice, it was still the old Good Life building. It was like one floor ready, people hanging out there, but you could see the vision that was being created, and you could see the potential for sort of an epicenter in London that would allow these collisions to happen. And what was beautiful about that was the connection between sort of nonprofits, social enterprise, government, and then private companies. And that was the part that also really excited me. In general, you know, I've been overwhelmed by the support. I wouldn't be here today with any of the support, whether that's been Tech Alliance, LEDC, like some of the larger organizations, London Health Science Center. They've supported us throughout all the way. And sometimes you think entrepreneurship has a very like lonely journey where you're just building things, but most entrepreneurs did not do this themselves. They relied heavily on the support around them. I would just add, it's even something as not small, but as impactful as, you know, working in the basement at Innovation Works with Zamir and a couple people, and, you know, Tyler trying to figure out how to run APIs and saying, Zamir, I can't do this, help me. And him, you know, making some of the first, first additions to help me get started on the path. So overall, the London support and ecosystem is an amazing group of people, and everyone's trying to lift each other up. So I'm also very appreciative of that aspect.
Great. Zamir?
Yeah, I have also a lot to say on this. I think, first of all, as you know, somebody who came through Propel as well, and when I did Propel, it was only a few years ago when I was I'm in my late 30s. I'm not the prototypical Propel participant, and I'm really glad and fortunate that Propel took a chance on someone like me to put me in that program. I thoroughly enjoyed it, being surrounded by young, ambitious entrepreneurs, and I think all of the supports in the city. I think when I first kind of came into the ecosystem, I had this outsider reaction of like, why are there so many organizations that are here to support entrepreneurs? Isn't there like a ton of overlap? And no, as I've navigated through all these systems, that they absolutely all serve different purposes and also support entrepreneurs in different phases of their journey. So, but they also have this great interconnection that Tyler spoke about. So, you know, it made me think of back when I met Tyler, I was at a Tech Alliance event and he was presenting there, and we got to talking afterwards, and he said, "Oh, I work in this space called Innovation Works," where, you know, I shortly joined him there. And as he said, you know, we ran a mastermind group there with, you know, 2 other founders that, you know, there's some really great companies coming out of that space. And so, you know, I can speak to LEDC has helped us get the word out about the company. Western has been very supportive through Propel and otherwise. Tech Alliance, and, you know, when I was just deciding I wanted to be an entrepreneur, I took their E1.0 entrepreneur bootcamp. When, for example, I'm going to miss some people, but there's so many places, but one particularly helpful place is called the Roundhouse Accelerator, which I only you know, joined up with when VidHug really started scaling. And so, you know, they were not geared towards the super early stage entrepreneur that I was before, but, you know, when in March of last year, essentially, you know, VidHug went from a business that could be run comfortably by one person to a business that needed between 5 to 10 people to run it within a few weeks. And let me tell you, we did not have 5 to 10 people within a few weeks in that business. And so to keep everything going and to support the incredible demand and amount of customers we had, getting that support from a place like the Roundhouse Accelerator VidHug wouldn't be here today without that. And also VidHug wouldn't be here today if Propel hadn't, you know, and Tech Alliance hadn't shown that that interest in the company before. Because as an early stage founder, you got to hold on to all the people and the organizations that believe in you, because it can get hard. And so to have that not only from, you know, people around you, but from organizations and institutions is key to keeping entrepreneurs going until they hit that, you know, inflection point to success.
Thank you, Zamir. Yes. Just to continue with this question around community and the support that it gives. A question for Johnson, actually, from the Q&A from the audience. Johnson, we'd like to hear about your experience with local community partners and how you stayed innovative during these times. You sell your candles through other London shops, for example, Purely Natural. How's community helped you previously and now during the pandemic?
I've always kind of collaborated with local brands and try to get them in their stores. But since the stores have kind of closed up for now, I continue to work with Pretty Natural. They're one of the kind of the community. They push for the community always, and they've really helped me. And what we've done with Pretty Natural is we have a recycling program, so you can return back your empty tins there, and you get a free candle. So that's what we've that's kind of the main thing that we've done with Pretty Natural. Yeah.
Have there been other aspects of the community, Johnson, which have, just thinking more broadly about the support that your company has had, and maybe you've had as well in your startup journey, that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, Propel, Tech Alliance, and just getting together with other business entrepreneurs that I've met throughout the years, seeing if there's any collaborations that we can work with. Candles is one of the items where I'm able to collaborate with almost any brand, any company, and anyone to kind of formulate a scent for what they're kind of like. We're working on a candle for a mortgage company right now because the housing market has kind of really taken off. So now, now they're trying to do something different because now the competition has really risen. So yeah, working with local mortgage companies to provide them with their own scent, their own candles. Yeah, so just trying to collaborate with as many people as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a theme that's come out loud and clear from all three of you on the panel, for sure. We've got just over 7 minutes left, I think, by my reckoning. So I'd like to kind of start drawing things to a close. I'm still keeping an eye on Q&A, so please keep them coming, folks. But really just a few questions to wrap up. Sorry, a few moments to wrap up. One question that perhaps might be worth speculating about is, eventually this lockdown is going to end. Eventually we're going to move past this pandemic. I'm interested in all three of your views on what this means for not just your business, but maybe your sector more generally. Like, are we going to see any systematic, persistent changes? Or are we going to go back to business as usual? What's going to change and what's going to stay changed? Let me just open that up to whoever wants to kick that off.
Really giving us the crystal ball here, Simon.
All yours.
I mean, this is purely hypotheses from my perspective, but I've also had, I'm very curious about this myself. So I get to, talk to lots of customers, investors, partners, and just say, what's going on? I want to know, what does this look like? Right. And, for myself, this is, some people might be mad at me for saying this, but before the pandemic started, I had actually moved to Toronto specifically to participate in a program called the DMZ. And DMZ was sort of the software startup version of Innovation Works at London, very focused on high growth, early stage technology companies. And part of the reason why that was such a priority for me was that same thing, that conscious collision of these, minds all focused on this goal, which was build a lot of them software as a service and hit that inflection point that Zamir talked about. The part that now a lot of people are trying to figure out, obviously we've seen a mass exodus from some larger cities and then moving to places like London, and that's then had an impact locally on housing prices, on how people feel about the city. And then in my question, and again, this is not an answer, this is just something I'm posing, which is like when this pandemic does lift, when the world sort of reemerges, what does that look like? And for myself, there's two thoughts of it, which people are very comfortable at their homes. The term that I discovered during this pandemic was ambivert, which is sometimes you like being introverted, you love staying at home, but there is this human, desire to connect in person, desire to network, desire to be in community. And so I think as we come out of this pandemic, there will be less because people have found this comfort and they've found the ability, but there's still going to be this yearning to connect in person. And so I think people just generally, we seem to have a trend of when something temporary happens, we think that that's a permanent state. But I do think we will see a return to normal in some ways that, that this we'll look back at this as a weird phase in our human civilization, and then we'll get back on the road to connecting in person and community.
Yeah, thanks. I like the term ambivert. I don't think any of us are truly introverted or extroverted. I think this has helped us really focus on the question, though, of how introverted or extroverted we are, given how much time we have to spend on our own. Johnson, let's turn to you before I close with Zamir.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm in the business of being indoors for the most part. And there's always that challenge of what do you do for summer? Usually, we sell a lot of citronella candles to kind of keep bugs away.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to continue, especially this first kind of summer of kind of missing out last summer because people were still in lockdown. Beaches were kind of banned. But I think a lot of people are, especially Canadians, we're automatically locked down all winter. Now that summer is approaching with the nice weather really here, people are gonna spend time outdoor. So my speculation is gonna be a lot of people are gonna invest in their backyards, their pools, their decks, and spending a little bit more time outside, and they're gonna want to burn citronella candles and keep bugs away. So that's what I'm kind of currently working on is providing that kind of mood for the backyard.
Yeah, well, I'll be one of your customers almost certainly, Johnson. Yeah, I mean, within every cloud, there's a silver lining. Within every pandemic, there's an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
Zamir.
Yeah, this is obviously like the proverbial $1 million question for especially a business like VidHug, right? Because it really, celebrating a special occasion without being able to get together is something that demand went through the roof for when the pandemic started. And that's why VidHug saw the growth that it did. I do believe that when things go back to normal, and I do hope personally that, we go back to the activities that we were able to do before. There's nothing better than getting together in person to celebrate. Being able to give each other a real hug is a lot better than giving a virtual hug. That being said, I view that the pandemic was a form of marketing and also education for a lot of people, because we were forced into this very uncomfortable state of not being able to get together, not being able to get to the office. And we had to learn about all these tools like Zoom to work together, like having a proper home office to work from. And so I think people will go back to the way they were, but at the same time, I think a lot of them will say, there were parts of working from home that I didn't mind, and I might do that once or twice a week. And also they might say, we don't actually get together, even before the pandemic, we didn't actually ever get together for every birthday or special occasion anyways, but now I know of all these tools that I can use to fill those gaps. So I think we will return to normal life, but armed with new information and equipment and abilities that will stick with us. And so that's, really, we're seeing that even as, things start to return to normal, we're seeing with VidHug that people are continuing to use it both personally and professionally because we don't get together for everything anymore, even in a post-pandemic world. So yeah, I view it as a world scale education that happened.
Amen to that. And just to go back to your point about luck being where preparedness meets opportunity, I think the message that you're trying to convey here, Zamir, is be prepared and make the most of the skills that we've all had to develop during this and to try and help them position us to be more competitive and more effective at what we do when this lockdown eventually ends and we do get back to normal, hopefully.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it only remains for me to give a sincere thanks to Johnson, to Tyler, and to Zamir for joining us today and sharing their insights with us. Thank you both, all three of you. And Susan, back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Simon, and our esteemed panelists. It was really interesting to listen to your experiences and what you've been up to in the past year. And I have to agree that innovation is all about iteration and learning from each iteration and moving forward. So thank you. With that, I think I would like to invite Dr. Kevin Shoemaker, our Acting Associate VP at Western Research, to provide us with closing remark. Is Kevin with us?
Yes, I am.
Oh, welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. And I just want to thank all the speakers for this. This has been a really fun environment for me to listen to. It's not my field. I'm a physiologist, but I like to think that I think of new ideas and present them. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate the three groups and all the speakers. And I thank you all for attending as well on behalf of Western and Western Research. I would like to reflect on a couple of thoughts that I had through here, if I may, Suzanne. Probably more summary than anything, but Winston Churchill told us that we should never waste a crisis. And so the pandemic has been an interesting environment in which these speakers have actually lived out the experience of trying to affect change in a positive way. And somebody used the word survivorship. I think that resonates in both the research and in the commercialization space. It takes a lot of work to generate new information and then turn that ultimately into a product that the public needs or wants. And so there's this sense of need, there's a sense of preparedness that we have to think about all the time. A couple of things that came out really clear was the importance of other people, and that innovation doesn't occur in isolation.
in an isolation of people or an isolation of experience. It's all of your experiences that come together to merge. So being creative is not coming up with an idea new all the time. It's about how you converge different learnings and different experiences into something new. And these are great examples of folks, both from the research space and the commercialization space, the different groups here. So thanks for that. And the reliance on flexibility, being able to to judiciously think about how you're going to apply your skills in the context of a problem. And I think that's really important. I guess I'll just close with the idea, though, that at the end of the day, all of this work is thinking about what the public needs, and it could be something that's entertaining, or it could be something that's health, life, and death. But at the end of the day, all of this work through research, through commercialization, is targeting a need in the community. And so this is critical work that's being done. And I really want to thank the innovation ambassadors that give of their time and expertise and experiences to support the work of these innovators and these entrepreneurs. And I want to thank them as well for their survivorship mode, for the way that they help each other and to survive, and the way that they improve our lives. So thank you all for that work that you've done for us today as well. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Suzanne, for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. And I think, in follow up with that, I just want to say, as we close today's session, I'd like to remind you that highlight that our new monthly speaker series that's scheduled to begin on June 23rd is going to start. And that is really, it's an opportunity where we're a platform that we're going to bring our innovation ambassadors to share their work with our community and promote interdisciplinary collaboration. Each month, World Discovery will be hosting one innovation ambassador faculty and a speaker from a startup company in a similar field to share their innovation stories with the larger community. Please mark your calendars to join us on June 23rd as we welcome Dr. Mike Kachabaugh from Computer Science and Tyler Bryden from Speak AI to join us. Thank you very much and have a great day.